Tonight we're breaking down every sacred sword of Unova. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still fall asleep easily. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Imagine a world where the line between humanity and the wild is not just a border on a map, but a battlefield defined by fire and steel. In the heart of the Unova region, tucked away in the deepest thickets of Pinwheel Forest and the highest crags of Victory Road, there are whispers of a group of warriors who do not carry blades, but embody them. They are the Swords of Justice. While most legendary stories in the Pokémon world focus on the creation of the land or the mastery of time and space, the legend of the Sacred Swords is far more intimate and far more dangerous. It is a story born from the ashes of human greed and the desperate cry of the vulnerable. For centuries, the history of Unova has been a tug-of-war between truth and ideals, often leaving the natural world caught in the crossfire. But while the great dragons, Reshiram and Zekrom, were busy deciding the fate of civilizations, a different kind of guardian emerged from the shadows to protect those who had no voice. The Swords of Justice are unique among legendaries. They are not distant gods watching from another dimension. They are a brotherhood of martial masters who have spent an eternity honing their skills for one singular purpose: to stand as a bulwark against the encroachment of mankind. The core of their legend begins a tragedy that nearly wiped out the life of an entire province. Deep within the moor of Isirus, a devastating forest fire once raged, a blaze fueled by the reckless expansion of human settlements. As the trees turned to charcoal and the air filled with suffocating smoke, the Pokémon of the moor found themselves trapped. It was in this moment of absolute despair that 4 figures emerged from the haze. Cobalion, the iron-willed leader whose very gaze could command the wind to still. Terrakion, the powerhouse capable of shattering boulders with a single strike to clear a path for the fleeing. Virizion, the verdant speedster who darted through the flames like a green blur to snatch the young and the weak from the jaws of death. And finally, the youngest, the apprentice, who would become the heart of their fellowship, Keldeo. But who are these guardians really? Are they merely protectors of the forest? Or do they represent something deeper in the soul of the Unova region? To understand the Swords of Justice, we have to look past their physical forms and into the philosophy of the musketeers who inspired them. We have to ask why they chose to turn their backs on humanity for so long, and what it takes for a Pokémon to earn the title of a Sacred Sword. This isn't just a chronicle of stats and types. It is a deep dive into a legacy of honor, the weight of leadership, and the grueling journey of a young orphan trying to find its place among giants. We will explore the scorched earth of the Isirus fire, tracing the footprints of the trio as they saved the innocent and retreated into the mists of Claw. We will examine the silent pact they made to never trust a human again, a pact that stood for hundreds of years, until the arrival of a trainer who could prove that not all of humanity is a threat to the balance. We will look at the grueling training of Keldeo, the mythical cult who had to master the secret sword to truly join the ranks of its mentors, evolving not just in power, but in spirit, taking on its resolute form to face the challenges of a changing world. But the story of Unova's guardians doesn't end with the swords. To truly grasp the scope of protection in this land, we must look at the other entities that keep the chaos at bay. From the elemental fury of the forces of nature, Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus, who govern the very atmosphere, to the ancient sentinels like Sigilyph and Volcarona, who guarded the sun and the sands when the world was young. How do these different tiers of legends interact? How does a sword-wielding deer-like guardian relate to a dragon of pure truth? The stakes are higher than they appear. In Unova, justice isn't just a concept, it's a physical force. It's the difference between a forest thriving and a forest falling to the axe. It's the difference between a young Pokémon finding a family and being lost to the history of the ashes. As we peel back the layers of these myths, we find a region defined by its struggle for harmony. The Swords of Justice are the ultimate personification of that struggle. They are the guardians who watch from the tall grass, the warriors who wait in the caves, and the legends that remind us that even in a world of humans and machines, the wild still has its champions. Tonight, we journey through the tall grass of the pinwheel forest, climb the jagged cliffs of the giant chasm, and walk the hallowed grounds of the pledge grove. We are seeking the truth behind the steel, the grass, the rock and the water. We are uncovering the full story of the guardians who taught us that true power isn't just it's about having something worth fighting for. The Unova region is defined by a single ancient question. Is it better to pursue an ideal, no matter how impossible, or to accept the truth, no matter how harsh? This philosophical divide runs through the very bedrock of the region, shaping its history, its people, and its most elusive legends. But before we can understand the swords that guard this land, we must first understand the mist that hides them. In the earliest recorded accounts of Unova, travelers spoke of fleetings in the fog that clung to the moor of Osiris. They described figures that moved with the precision of a blade, yet possessed the grace of wild creatures. These were not mere Pokémon sightings. They were encounters that reshaped local folklore. Villagers whispered of four protectors who emerged only when the balance between human ambition and nature's will was threatened. The first of these sightings, documented in the journals of early settlers, tell of a steel-blue form that stood motionless on a ridge, its gaze cutting through the mist like a command. That was Cobalion, the first of the sacred swords to reveal itself to human eyes. But these sightings were not random. They occurred during a time when Unova was still wrestling with its own identity, a region caught between the relentless drive for progress and the quiet wisdom of the wild. The philosophical landscape of truth and ideals is not just a backdrop, it is the very soil from which these legends grow. The sacred swords are not merely powerful beings. They are living embodiments of the choices Unova must make. Do we build our cities higher, or do we preserve the forests that give us breath? The swords chose their answer long ago. As the mist thinned, more stories emerged. Terrakion, the rock-hard enforcer, was said to shatter boulders with a single charge, clearing paths for fleeing Pokémon. Virizion, swift as a gust of wind, would appear and disappear before a witness could blink, leaving only the scent of fresh grass. And then there was the youngest, Keldeo, whose tale is woven from tragedy and hope. But these are not just stories of heroism, they are warnings. Each sighting carried a lesson about the cost of ignoring the natural world. And so, we stand at the threshold of a 4.5-hour journey into the protectors of the wild. This is not a simple recounting of facts. It is an exploration of how a region's deepest fears and highest aspirations can crystallize into legend. Every blade, every scar on the land, every whisper in the wind, they all point to a single haunting event that would forever define the sacred swords. An event that began with smoke rising from the moor of Osiris and ended with a young Pokémon orphaned in the ashes. That story is known as the Tragedy of the Moor. The previous chapter left us standing at the edge of Unova's mist, where the first whispers of three blade-like figures drifted through the forest. But before those legends could take shape, there was a fire so vast, so complete, that it would etch itself into the very bones of the region's history. It began not with a lightning strike or a volcanic eruption, but with the slow, grinding advance of human ambition. For generations, the moor of Osiris had been a sanctuary, a vast stretch of wetlands and ancient woodland, where Pokémon like the gentle deerling and the lumbering mamoswine roamed in relative peace. But the world beyond the moor was changing. New towns were rising, roads were being carved, and resources were being claimed. The human appetite for expansion had turned its gaze toward the moor's rich soil and timber. And where there is appetite, there is conflict. Warfare, as it often found its way to the edges of the wild. Not a single declared battle, but a series of skirmishes and encroachments, trespasses that pushed deeper each season. Fires were set to clear land, fences were raised to mark territory, and in the chaos of one particularly careless campaign, a spark caught the dry grass of late summer. Within hours, the entire moor was a furnace. Imagine the sound, the crackling of ancient oaks, the roar of flames taller than any building, and beneath it all, the cries of Pokémon trapped in a world that had become a cage of smoke and ash. The wind carried the fire eastward, jumping streams and smothering the underbrush, entire species that had thrived for centuries in the isolation of the moor. The Lilliput, the Watchog, the timid Pignite, found their escape routes cut off. The fire was not natural, it was human-born, and it was merciless. As the inferno raged, something stirred in the deepest groves of the moor. A group of 3 Pokémon, known until then only in fragmentary carvings and whispered tales, rose from the heat. They were not merely strong, they were made of purpose. The first was a figure of iron and calm, with a gaze that could still a stampede. The second was a mountain of raw force, its hooves shattering boulders as it cleared a path. The third moved like a breeze through the smoke, its horns cutting the air with surgical precision. They emerged not as warriors seeking glory, but as shepherds. They herded the panicked Pokémon away from the flames, guiding them through the burning corridors of the moor. They did not speak, but their presence was a command. Survive. The fire would not claim everything, not while they stood. This was the first recorded intervention of these beings in human history. They did not attack the humans who had caused the blaze. They did not seek revenge. Their purpose was singular, to protect those who could not protect themselves. And in doing so, they became legends. But the fire left scars. The moor would never fully recover, and in the ashes, a single orphaned foal would be found, a Keldeo, alone and terrified, whose cry would echo through the smoke and change the trio's destiny forever. That story, though, belongs to another chapter. For now, we must turn our attention to the leader of that rescue, the one who first stepped into the flames with eyes that held no fear, only an iron will that could bend fate itself. The smoke had barely cleared from the moor of Icyrus when the true horror of what had happened began to settle. The fire, sparked by human conflict and fueled by the dry summer winds, had raged for days, consuming everything in its path. Pokémon that had once thrived in those wetlands, Sawsbuck, Stunfisk, even the rare Frillish that drifted through the deeper pools, were now scattered, terrified and leaderless. The survivors huddled in small, trembling groups, their instincts screaming at them to flee, but with no clear direction, they simply ran in circles, panic spreading faster than the flames ever could. It was in that moment of utter chaos that a single figure emerged from the ash and ember. Its hide was steel blue, its horns sharp as blades, and its eyes held a calm that seemed to cut through the noise. This was Cobalion, the Iron Will, and it had come to bring order to the disorder. Cobalion is the leader of the Swords of Justice, and its design is no accident. The trio, Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion, are directly inspired by the Three Musketeers from Alexandre Dumas' classic novel. Cobalion, in particular, mirrors Athos, the eldest and most composed of the group. Athos was the strategist, the one who kept his head when others lost theirs, the one whose quiet authority commanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. Cobalion embodies that same archetype. It does not roar or charge blindly into danger. Instead, it stands still, observes, and then acts with precision. Its very presence is a statement. There is no need for panic when I am here. But Cobalion's role as a tactical commander goes beyond mere inspiration. In the games, its signature ability is Justified, which raises its attack stat by 1 stage whenever it is hit by a dark-type move. This is not just a battle mechanic. It is a reflection of its nature. Cobalion does not seek out conflict, but when attacked, it does not cower. It absorbs the blow, channels that dark energy into strength, and retaliates with even greater force. In the context of the Moor of Icyrus fire, this ability translates into something more profound. The panicked Pokémon were not being attacked by a physical enemy. They were being salted by fear itself. Fear is a dark force, one that paralyzes and scatters. Cobalion's stern gaze, its unwavering posture, acted as a counter to that darkness. Every terrified cry, every desperate scramble, these were the dark-type moves of the psyche. And Cobalion, with its iron will, absorbed them, turned them into resolve, and led the survivors to safety. Why was that stern gaze so necessary? Because panic is contagious. One frightened Pokémon can trigger a stampede, and a stampede in a burning forest means death for the weak and the young. Cobalion understood that the first step to survival was not speed or strength, but calm. It stood at the edge of the inferno, its eyes fixed on the fleeing masses, and it did not blink. That unyielding stare told the Pokémon, I see you. I am not afraid. Follow me. And they did. They formed a line behind the steel blue guardian, and step by step, Cobalion led them through the smoke, around the collapsing trees, and out of the moor of Icyrus. It was not a sprint. It was a measured, deliberate march. Every movement was calculated, every pause a chance for the stragglers to catch up. This was the tactical commander at work, not just fighting a fire, but orchestrating an evacuation. The lore tells us that Cobalion's role in that fire was to calm the unruly Pokémon with its stern gaze. But think about what that means. Unruly does not mean aggressive. It means disorganized, chaotic, lost. The Pokémon were not fighting Cobalion. They were fighting their own terror, and Cobalion's gaze was the anchor that held them steady. It is a reminder that true leadership is not about being the loudest or the strongest. It is about being the still point in a turning world. Athos the Musketeer was known for his melancholy and his quiet wisdom. Cobalion carries that same weight. It has seen the worst of what humans and nature can do, and yet it stands, unbowed, ready to guide again. As the fire finally died, and the survivors found refuge in the distant forests and caves, Cobalion did not rest. It knew that the threat was not over. The human encroachment that had sparked the blaze would return, and the Pokémon would need more than a single leader. They would need a team, and so Cobalion began to seek out others who could share its burden. Terrakion, the unstoppable force that could shatter any barrier, and Virizion, the swift blade that could strike before danger even formed. Together, they would become the Swords of Justice. But that story is still unfolding. For now, let us turn our attention to the one who broke the rocks and cleared the path, the embodiment of raw power that no wall could hold back. Up next is Chapter 4, Terrakion, the unstoppable force. We left off with Cobalion, the iron will, the stern commander whose gaze could calm a panicking herd. But even the most disciplined leader cannot move a mountain alone, and in the chaos of the Moor of Osiris fire, the greatest obstacle was not the flames themselves, but the rubble they left behind. That is where the second of the Swords of Justice steps into the legend, not as a tactician, but as a battering ram. Terrakion embodies the Porthos archetype from the Musketeer mythos, the one who does not strategize, who does not negotiate, who simply acts. Where Cobalion was the shield that held the line, Terrakion was the hammer that broke the wall. In the lore of Unova, this Pokémon is described as having a body of living stone, muscles that ripple with the force of tectonic plates. Its very presence reshapes the battlefield, and during the Great Fire, that raw physical power became the difference between life and death for countless trapped Pokémon. Picture the scene. The Moor of Osiris is a landscape of marsh and peat, but when the fire swept through, it did not just burn the grass. It ignited the very soil, turning soft ground into brittle, cracked earth. And as the flames advanced, they toppled ancient trees, shattered rock formations, and sent boulders tumbling into the only escape routes. Pokémon fled in every direction, only to find their paths blocked by walls of debris. Some were pinned beneath fallen stone. Others were cornered against cliffs, with no way up. The smoke was thick, the heat unbearable, and then Terrakion arrived. It did not hesitate. It did not assess the situation with a calculating eye. It simply charged. The ground shook with every step. Witnesses in the old texts describe a sound like a landslide, a deep rolling thunder that preceded the creature's arrival. Terrakion lowered its head, its horns gleaming like chiseled granite, and it struck the largest boulder, blocking the path. The impact sent cracks spiderwebbing through the stone, and with a second blow, the boulder shattered into gravel. Dust and splinters filled the air, but the way was clear. The trapped Pokémon scrambled through the gap, and Terrakion moved on to the next obstacle. This was not a single act of heroism. It was a systematic demolition. For hours, Terrakion carved a network of escape routes through the burning moor. It lifted fallen tree trunks with its forelegs, tossed aside slabs of rock that weighed more than a dozen men, and even used its own body as a ram to punch through collapsed cave entrances. The geological impact of its strength on the Unovan landscape is still visible today. Geologists and Pokémon researchers have noted that certain valleys in the Osiris area bear the unmistakable marks of massive, blunt force trauma, as if some enormous creature had smashed through the bedrock. These are not the work of natural erosion. They are the scars left by Terrakion's passage. Consider the scale. Terrakion is not the largest of the Swords of Justice, but its power is concentrated, explosive. Its rock typing gives it a connection to the earth itself. And when it strikes, it does not merely break stone, it pulverizes it. The fragments become new terrain. Over the centuries, those shattered boulders have been weathered into the rocky outcroppings that dot the moor of Osiris today. Every jagged cliff, every scattered pile of scree is a monument to that desperate rescue. The land itself remembers, but there is a deeper layer to this. Porthos, in the original novel, was the musketeer driven by appetite and physical strength, but also by a fierce loyalty. Terrakion mirrors that. Its power is not mindless destruction. It is directed, purposeful, born of a need to protect. In the heat of the fire, it did not fight the flames. It fought the barriers that kept others from escaping. It was the unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, and the immovable object lost every time. And yet, for all its brute force, Terrakion is not reckless. It knows exactly where to strike. The old stories tell of it, pausing before each boulder, tilting its head as if listening to the stone, then hitting the precise weak point. This is not just strength, it is knowledge, an instinctive understanding of geology and pressure. It is the wisdom of the earth itself. By the time the fire was contained, Terrakion had cleared paths that would later become the main routes through the moor. The Pokémon it saved scattered into the surrounding forests, carrying the legend of the Stone Guardian with them. And as the smoke cleared, the third member of the Swords of Justice appeared on the horizon, moving with a grace that seemed impossible after so much destruction. Where Terrakion had torn through the landscape, Virizion would bring something else into something the burned earth desperately needed. Terrakion had done its work. The boulders that once sealed the escape routes of the Moor of Osiris lay shattered. The path cleared for the fleeing Pokémon, but the fire was still alive, still hungry. It did not simply burn, it leapt. Embers caught the wind and carried the blaze forward, faster than any creature could run. And that is where the third member of the Swords of Justice reveals its true nature. Where Cobalion commanded and Terrakion broke, Virizion moved. It did not stand against the flames. It ran ahead of them. Virizion is the elegant one, the one whose name is whispered in the same breath as grace, as poise, as something almost too beautiful to be a weapon. But make no mistake, this is a creature born of the same tragedy that forged its companions, and its beauty is a mask for lethality. The inspiration is clear. Aramis, the musketeer of refinement and romance, the swordsman who fought with style as much as steel. And yet, in the Pokémon world, that refinement takes on a different meaning. Virizion does not simply fight, it dances, and its dance is death. When the firestorm swept across the moor, Virizion did not try to match Terrakion's brute force. It could not. Its slender frame, its long sweeping horns, its delicate green hide, all of it seemed ill-suited for a disaster of that scale. But the flames did not care about appearances. They cared about fuel, and Virizion understood. The only way to save the Pokémon caught in the inferno was to become faster than the fire itself. So it ran, not away from the blaze, but alongside it, weaving through the smoke, herding the terrified creatures into pockets of safety that Cobalion had identified. Its speed was not just a luxury, it was a necessity. Every second mattered. Every misstep meant another life lost. And here is the contrast that defines Virizion. The very traits that make it look fragile are the ones that make it deadly. Its grass typing, the verdant green that covers its body, is not a weakness in this context. It is a weapon. Virizion can call upon the forest itself, coaxing vines from the scorched earth, creating barriers of living wood that slow the fire's advance. And its fighting type, that raw, close-quarters power, manifests not in crushing blows but in precise, lightning-quick strikes. Its signature move, Sacred Sword, is a blade of pure energy that ignores defenses. It is the perfect technique for a creature that cannot afford to waste a single motion. The Pokédex entries across generations paint a consistent picture. Virizion is said to have been born from the very essence of the forest, a guardian of the plants and the creatures that depend on them. Its horns are sharp enough to cut through steel, yet they are often depicted curving elegantly, almost like a crown. It is a paradox, the gentle protector that can kill with a single fluid slash. And that paradox is exactly what makes it so effective in the chaos of the moor. While Terrakion was the hammer, Virizion was the scalpel. It did not fight the fire head-on. It outran it, outmaneuvered it, and in doing so, saved those who could not save themselves. There is a reason the legend of the Swords of Justice does not end with the fire. The story continues because one life was not saved in time. One small Pokémon was left behind in the ashes, orphaned by the flames, and that orphan would grow to become something more than a survivor. It would become the fourth blade. But that is a story for another moment. For now, let us remember Virizion not as a mere fighter, but as the verdant grace that moved faster than the inferno, a whisper of green against a world of red and black, proving that elegance and lethality are not opposites. They are two sides of the same sacred sword. Virizion had raced ahead, a green blur against the blackened sky. But when the last ember faded and the wind finally stilled, the true test of the Swords of Justice was just beginning. The Moor of Icyrus was no longer a place of life. It was a graveyard of ash and silence. The trio had guided hundreds of fleeing Pokémon to safety, herded them through Terrakian's shattered rock barriers, shielded them behind Cobalian's steadfast gaze, and led them with Virizion's swift, weaving paths. But now, in the aftermath, the smoke settled into a thick, suffocating blanket over the charred earth. The flames had consumed everything. The tall grasses, the ancient trees, the nests and burrows that had sheltered generations. What remained was a landscape of ghosts. And it was here, in the cold grey dawn, that they found something that should not have survived. A young Keldeo, no older than a foal, stood trembling at the edge of a collapsed den. Its coat was streaked with soot, its eyes wide, with a terror that went beyond the physical. It had been separated from its herd, its family likely lost in the inferno. The fire had spared it by chance. Perhaps a sudden shift in the wind, perhaps a pocket of damp earth. But the cost was absolute isolation. The creature was a mythical Pokémon, a being of rare power and ancient lineage. Yet in that moment it was just a frightened child, alone in a world that had turned to cinders. The discovery of a young, terrified Keldeo in the aftermath of the blaze would become the turning point for the trio. They had no obligation to stay. Their duty was to protect the vulnerable. But this one was not a victim of the fire. It was a survivor of a fate they could not undo. And yet, as Cobalion approached with measured steps, Terrakian hanging back with a rare gentleness, Virizion crouching low to meet the foal's gaze, something shifted. These three legendary guardians, warriors forged in countless battles, had seen enough death and destruction to last a lifetime, but they had never seen a being so utterly broken by loss. Why did they choose to adopt a mythical outsider rather than leaving it to nature? The answer lies in the very fire that had scarred the land. Nature had already spoken. It had delivered a verdict of cruelty and chaos. To leave Keldeo to its own devices would have been to abandon it to the same forces that had consumed its home. But the trio understood something deeper. They themselves were orphans of conflict. Cobalion born from the ashes of a forgotten war. Terrakion carved from the rubble of collapsed mountains. Virizion sprouting from soil soaked in old blood. They were not bound by blood or species. They were bound by purpose. And in Keldeo, they saw a reflection of their own fractured beginnings. The emotional core of the group, a family forged in fire rather than blood, emerged not through grand declarations, but through small acts. Cobalion stood watch while Keldeo slept, its iron will softening into vigilance. Terrakian taught the foal how to break through obstacles without breaking itself, cracking boulders with a controlled fury that became a lesson in restraint. Virizion showed it how to move through the world with grace, to turn fear into speed. They did not simply train the young mythical. They raised it. They gave it a history, a code, a reason to believe that the embers of hope could be fanned back into flame. And as the seasons turned and the Moor of Icyrus slowly greened again, Keldeo grew stronger. It learned to harness the water within itself, drawing on the hidden rivers that ran beneath the ash. It learned the signature technique that would one day define its legend, Secret Sword, a move that blended fluid form with precise strike. But more than technique, it learned loyalty. It learned that family is not defined by where you come from, but by who stands beside you when the world burns. Yet even as this new bond solidified, The trio knew that their role was not to shelter the foal forever. They were guardians, not nursemaids, and guardians follow a code, a set of principles that had guided them long before the fire, a code that would soon be put to the test in ways none of them could anticipate. For a family forged in fire must also learn how to face the flames that still smoulder beyond their borders. And that code, that unspoken law of the swords, would demand more from Keldeo than any battle ever could. What does it mean to live by a code when the world around you refuses to follow any rules at all? That is the question that will pull us into the next chapter of this legend. It was one thing to rescue a single life from the ashes of a forest. It was quite another to decide that this rescued life would be raised, not as a survivor, but as a weapon for justice. The trio, Terrakion, Verizion, had never taken on an apprentice before. They had never needed to. Their own roles were forged in the heat of catastrophe, not inherited through mentorship. Yet the small, trembling form of Keldeo, shivering in the shadow of the moor of Isiris's lingering smoke, forced them to reconsider what their existence truly meant. For centuries, the swords of justice had defined themselves by what they opposed. They stood against human expansion, against the corruption of power, against the flames that consumed the habitats of innocent Pokémon. But opposition, they realized, was only half of a creed. A sword that only blocks is still a sword waiting to be swung. Protection is not merely reactionary, it is proactive. It requires a philosophy, a code that governs not just battles, but every act of kindness, every decision to hide rather than fight, every moment spent training a young mythical instead of patrolling for threats. That philosophy became known as the sacred sword, not a technique, not a move to be taught in battle, but a way of life. The sacred sword is the belief that the strongest being in the world is not the one who can topple a mountain or shatter a glacier. The strongest being is the one who kneels down to shield a wounded Pokémon from the rain. It is the belief that power is meaningless if it is not exercised in service of the weak. The trio had witnessed firsthand how humans who pursued power had turned the moor of Isiris into a graveyard. They had seen empires of brick and iron rise over the bones of forests, and they had made a sacred vow. Never again would strength be used to crush the helpless underfoot. This code shaped everything about their existence after the fire. It dictated where they chose to live. They could have remained in the open, roaming the lands of Unova as visible guardians, challenging every human who encroached on nature, but that would have been a pursuit of power, an endless war of attrition that would only escalate. Instead, they chose obscurity. They chose to become reclusive legends, hidden in the most secret corners of the region, because the sacred sword also demanded wisdom. The wisdom to know that sometimes the greatest protection is to vanish. Pinwheel Forest became the sanctuary of Kobleian, deep within those twisting paths, where the canopy forms a cathedral of leaves, and the light filters down like stained glass. The Iron Will Pokémon made its home. The forest's labyrinthine design, its shifting trails and sudden clearings are not natural. They are the result of centuries of deliberate alteration. Kobleian used its stern gaze not to command, but to guide the forest itself into a maze that only the pure of heart could navigate. Any human who stumbled in seeking trophies or rare Pokémon would find themselves lost, turned around by the subtle pressure of an ancient will. To hide here was not cowardice. It was a sacred duty to keep intruders away from the innocent creatures that dwelled within. Route 11, a narrow stretch of desert and rocky outcrops, became the domain of Terrakion. At first glance, it seems an unlikely home for a Pokémon of such raw power, but Terrakion understood something profound. The best shield is not one that absorbs blows, but one that never has to. By placing itself on the fringes of human civilization, it created a buffer zone. Its presence alone was a deterrent, a silent warning that anyone who crossed into the territory would face a force like a breaking avalanche. The rocks of Route 11 are not randomly scattered. They are the remnants of barriers. Terrakion shattered long ago to clear escape routes for fleeing Pokémon. then carefully rearranged into natural barricades. Here the code of protection was written in stone. Virizion chose the verdant fields, though in the games this location is simpler. Yet the spirit of her choice remains. She found a place where beauty and danger coexisted. She needed agility to protect, to weave between trees and dodge human traps. The fields, open yet bordered by forest, allowed her to keep watch over a larger area while still remaining hidden. Her speed was her shield, and she wrapped that shield around every creature that passed beneath her gaze. But there was a cost to this reclusive existence. The Swords of Justice, once active guardians who led evacuations and faced the flames directly, faded into myth. Humans stopped fearing them, stopped respecting them. They became stories told to children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. The trio watched from the shadows as the world moved on. As new fires were lit, new forests cleared, and they watched Keldeo grow. The young mythical had learned their code by osmosis. It could not be taught through lectures. It could only be lived. Every day, Keldeo saw Cobalion turn away a hiker without violence. It witnessed Terrakion use its strength to lift a fallen boulder from a burrow rather than crush it. It observed Virizion race beside a fleeing Pidove, not to catch it, but to guide it to safety. And in those small, quiet acts, the sacred sword philosophy was engraved into the very soul of the adoptive child. Yet a question lingered in the air, unspoken. Was this code enough? Could protection through hiding truly safeguard the vulnerable forever? Or was there a time when the shield must become a blade? The answer they knew would come when Keldeo was ready, and that moment was approaching faster than any of them anticipated. Because the sacred sword is not merely a philosophy of defense, it is also a promise of justice. And justice, unlike power, does not wait for permission. It moves when the innocent cry out. The trio had chosen to become reclusive legends, but legends have a way of waking up. The ashes of the Moor of Isiris had long since cooled, but the fire in Keldeo's heart was just beginning to kindle, and that fire would eventually demand something more than hiding. It would demand the secret sword. The trio had laid down their code, a sacred oath to protect the weak, and never to pursue power for its own sake. But a code is only as strong as those who carry it forward. And so, when they found the orphaned Keldeo shivering among the ashes of the Moor of Icarus, they did not simply offer shelter, they offered a path that would demand everything the young mythical Pokémon had to give. Keldeo was not born into the legacy of the sacred swords, it was adopted into it. And adoption, in the world of legendary guardians, is not a gentle hand on the shoulder, it is a forge. The trio, Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, took the frightened foal and began a training regimen that would break most Pokémon within the first week. This was not a matter of leveling up through battles or collecting experience points. This was a trial of the spirit, a crucible designed to test whether Keldeo possessed the mental fortitude to become something more than a survivor. The grueling training regimen Keldeo underwent to earn its place was not recorded in any Pokédex entry, but the legends whisper of it. Each day began before dawn, with Terrakion forcing Keldeo to charge headlong into stone walls, not to injure, but to teach it that pain is a teacher. Virizion would then challenge the young Pokémon, who races through dense thickets, where one misstep meant a tangle of thorns, and Cobalion, the stern leader, would stand motionless for hours, requiring Keldeo to hold a stance, to focus its mind until the world around it faded into silence. There was no room for distraction, no room for doubt. The trio knew that a sword that wavers is no sword at all. But why such intensity? Because the move they intended to teach Keldeo was not a technique you can learn from a TM or a tutor. The secret sword is not merely a physical attack. It is a manifestation of the user's inner conviction. In the games, Secret Sword is a unique fighting type move that deals damage using the user's special attack stat, but it targets the opponent's physical defense. This mechanical quirk is deeply symbolic. The sword strikes not with raw muscle, but with the sharpness of the soul. It bypasses the usual rules of combat, just as Keldeo must bypass its own limitation. The symbolic and mechanical significance of the move, Secret Sword, lies in this paradox. It is a blade forged from thought, from will, from the unyielding belief that justice must cut through any armor. And here is where the evolution of Keldeo diverges from every other Pokémon. Most creatures evolve when they accumulate enough experience, when their bodies reach a certain size or age. But Keldeo's evolution is tied to a mental state rather than physical leveling. It does not evolve by fighting 1,000 battles. It evolves by understanding one truth, that it is worthy of the sword. The resolute form is not a new set of muscles or a thicker hide. It is the moment when Keldeo stops seeing itself as the orphan in the ashes and starts seeing itself as the fourth sacred sword. That transformation cannot be forced. It must be earned through the very training that seemed so cruel at first. The trio knew this. They pushed Keldeo to the edge of exhaustion, to the brink of giving up, because only at that edge does a Pokémon truly decide who it wants to be. And when the day came, when Keldeo finally stood before them, trembling but unbroken, and unleashed the secret sword for the first time, the blade that erupted was not made of water or energy. It was made of certainty. The ground split, the air hummed, and the three older swords of justice bowed their heads in recognition. That moment, that awakening, is what we will explore next. Because the resolute form is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of Keldeo's true journey. A journey that would test the very code the trio had sworn to uphold. Keldeo mastered Secret Sword, but the move was never the end goal. It was the key that unlocked the door to something far greater. The grueling training under Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion had forged a blade. But a blade is nothing without a hand that knows when to strike and when to sheathe. The true test was not strength, but the wisdom to wield it. And that test would culminate in a transformation unlike any seen among the legendary swords of Unova. For years, Keldeo remained in its ordinary form, a small colt-like creature with a single flowing mane and horns that had not yet fully emerged. It was a form that spoke of potential, not fulfillment. The trio had seen this before in themselves, perhaps, but they also knew that Keldeo carried a burden they never had. It was the only one among them born from the ashes of tragedy, orphaned in a fire that scarred the Moor of Isirus. That wound never healed. It shaped Keldeo's vulnerability, its doubt and its desperate need to prove itself. And so the training was not merely physical. It was a long, patient sculpting of the spirit. Then came the moment of awakening, when Keldeo finally internalized the code of justice, not as a set of commands, but as a living principle. Its body reacted. The horn that had been short and stubby began to twist and lengthen, spiraling like a drill imbued with the very essence of the swords. It grew not as a weapon of aggression, but as a symbol of purpose, a blade that could cut through doubt and pierce the heart of injustice. And alongside the horn, something stranger appeared. From the tips of its mane, delicate, feather-like plumes unfurled. They were not feathers from birds, but ethereal tokens, each one carrying a whisper of the mentors who had shaped it. One plume bore the stern grey of Cobalion's iron will, another the rugged brown of Terrakion's unyielding strength, and a third the soft green of Virizion's fleeting grace. Keldeo had absorbed not just their teachings, but a piece of their very souls. This was the resolute form, a physical manifestation of maturity earned through trial, not time. The visual storytelling is exquisite. The horn growth mirrors the way a young blade is honed from a rough ingot into a fine edge. The feathers represent the transfer of wisdom from master to student, but they are also anchors. They remind Keldeo that it is never alone, that the quartet is now whole. In folklore, such transformations often signify a rite of passage. But here it is something more intimate. Keldeo does not simply become stronger, it becomes a vessel for the combined ethos of the sacred swords. The ordinary form was a child holding a sword. The resolute form is the sword itself, alive and moving with purpose. The moment the transformation completes, the quartet is finally complete. For the first time since the fire, Cobalion can rest. Terrakion can lower his guard. Virizion can stop running. Keldeo's maturity seals the bond that was always meant to be. They are no longer three protectors and a stray. They are four principles standing as one. The legend now has a fourth verse, and the name Swords of Justice gains its full resonance. But the awakening of Keldeo also ripples outward into the deeper currents of Unova's mythology. The power of the resolute form is not an isolated miracle. It echoes a larger pattern of transformation and balance that permeates the region. Consider the forces that govern truth and ideals. The ancient dragon that split into three, each piece seeking to complete itself. Keldeo's journey from ordinary to resolute mirrors that same yearning for wholeness. But on a smaller, more personal scale, the sacred swords may guard the lands and the Pokémon within them, but the Tao Trio guards the very soul of Unova. How these two layers of guardianship intertwine is a story that awaits just beyond the reach of Keldeo's newly sharpened horn. The horn had barely finished growing on Keldeo's head when the question of purpose arose. The four swords of justice, now reunited, stood as living monuments to a single code: protect the weak, punish the oppressor. But in Unova, there is a deeper resonance, a quiet, almost invisible thread connecting these steel-clad guardians to the three dragons that shaped the region's very soul. Reshiram and Zekrom embody forces far more abstract than fire and rock, truth and ideals. And yet, the Swords of Justice seem to exist in a space between those two pillars, neither fully embracing the cold certainty of truth, nor the passionate drive of ideals. So we have to ask, what do the swords actually serve? And is there a third path? One carved not from dragon flames, but from the ashes of a burning moor. The parallel begins with the fundamental nature of the swords themselves. Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo. They do not argue over whether the world should be ruled by objective facts or by the strength of one's convictions. They act. Their justice is not debated, it is enacted. In the aftermath of the Moor of Isirus Fire, they did not pause to ask if the Pokémon they rescued deserved saving based on some philosophical principle. They saw suffering and they moved. This is a kind of neutrality, but not the neutrality of indifference. It is the neutrality of action, a refusal to be pulled into the ideological war that the Tao Trio represents. Reshiram burns with the white fire of truth, demanding that all pretense be stripped away. Zekrom crackles with the black lightning of ideals, urging that the world be reshaped according to a vision. But the swords offer a simpler, more ancient code. We protect because it is right, not because it is true or ideal, because it is necessary. Yet the tension between the swords and the dragons runs deeper than philosophy. In the lore of Unova, the original dragon, before it split into Reshiram and Zekrom, was a being of immense unity. When it was sundered by the brothers' quarrel over truth versus ideals, the world itself fractured. Curum, the empty shell left behind, embodies the cost of that division. Now consider the swords, four individuals bound by a shared mission, yet each distinct in form and power. They are not fractured, they are complementary. Their unity is not born from a single origin, but from a shared purpose. In that sense, they represent what the Tao Trio lost, a harmony that exists before the choice between truth and ideals is even made. There is a quiet tension in the geography of Unova itself. The swords dwell in hidden corners. Pinwheel Forest, Route 11, the moors, places that are wild and untamed. The dragons, by contrast, are tied to the great towers of the region. The Dragon Spiral Tower, the Relic Castle, the Giant Chasm. One group lingers in the shadows of human encroachment. The other is entwined with the ancient conflicts of civilization. When the brothers first argued over the proper way to build a world, they called upon Reshiram and Zekrom to settle the dispute. The swords never involve themselves in such debates. They do not build cities or kingdoms. They patrol the margins, and in doing so, they guard a kind of primordial neutrality that predates the dragon's schism. Could it be, then, that the Swords of Justice represent a forgotten third path? Not the path of the original dragon, which was too vast to be contained, but a path of grounded, practical guardianship, while Reshiram illuminates and Zekrom electrifies. The swords cut through the noise. Their signature move, Sacred Sword, is a strike that ignores barriers. It does not argue, it acts. In a region defined by the duel between truth and ideals, the swords stand as a reminder that some things are worth protecting without needing a justification beyond the act itself. They do not serve either dragon, but they do serve the world that the dragon's conflict left behind. And that service brings us to another set of ancient protectors, beings whose origins are even older than the swords, older than the Tao trio, guardians who watched over cities now buried under the shifting sands of the desert. The next chapter will take us deep into the ruins of Unova's forgotten past, where the very stones whisper of civilizations that rose and fell long before the first human ever held a sword. It is a story of Sigalith and Volcarona, of shrines in the relic castle, and of what it truly means to defend something eternal. Chapter 11. Guardians of the Ancient Cities. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. We ended the last chapter with a question that lingers like the embers of the Isiris fire. Do the swords of justice serve truth, or ideals, or something else entirely? Perhaps the answer is not in the dragons at all, but in the stones of Unova's oldest ruins. Because while Kobalian, Terrakian, and Verizian turned their backs on human civilization, other Guardian chose to remain. Let us leave the moor of Isiris for a moment and travel south across the desert. The desert resort, as modern trainers know it, is a sea of shifting sand, scarred by the relics of an ancient city. At its heart lies the relic castle, a structure half buried and half forgotten, its corridors whispering with the echoes of a people who once worshipped the sun. And there, circling the castle's highest spires, you will find Sigalith. Sigalith is not a Pokémon you encounter by accident. It hovers with an almost mechanical grace, its body a tapestry of ancient symbols, its single eye unblinking. The Pokédex tells us that Sigalith were the guardians of an ancient city, carved into the stone walls to protect the inhabitants from intruders. But over centuries, those carvings rose from the walls and became living sentinels. They are artificial guardians, born from human craft and human fear, given life by a civilization that has long since turned to dust. And that is the difference. The swords of justice are natural guardians. They were born with power, bound by a code they chose for themselves. They fled from humans, because humans had betrayed the trust of the wild. But Sigalith were created by humans. They were placed like statues or traps to enforce the will of a people who wanted to keep their treasures safe. They never had a choice. This is the mystery that haunts the relic castle. Why did some guardians stay while the swords ran? The answer is not simple. The swords of justice saw the fire in Isiris, and they saw humans as the cause. They chose to protect the natural world by withdrawing from human society altogether. But the guardians of the ancient cities, Sigalith, and even a creature like Volcarona, who once acted as a substitute sun to warm the world after a catastrophe, they remained bound to human structures. They became symbols of a bond that was broken, but not erased. Perhaps it is a matter of purpose. The swords were protectors of the wild, not of cities. Their duty was to the Pokémon of the forest and the fields. But Sigalith were protectors of a civilization. Their reason for existing was tied to the very people who had carved them. When that civilization fell, Sigalith did not flee. They stayed, continuing their patrol over empty halls and silent courtyards, because that is what they were made to do. And then there is Volcarona, the sun substitute. Its story is so ancient, so central to Unova's lore, that it deserves its own chapter entirely. For now, understand that while the swords of justice represent a freedom born from crisis, the guardians of the ancient cities represent a duty that outlasts the ones who asked for it. One group fled the fire, the other watched the fire from the walls, and then watched the ashes cool. So when we ask whether the swords serve truth or ideals, we must also ask, what truth do the ancient guardians serve? And what ideal drives a being that has no memory of its creators, only the command to protect? The answer may lie not in the sword, but in the relic. And in the next chapter, we will uncover the story of the one who became the sun itself. We left off within the shadows of the relic castle, where Sigilif once stood as silent watchers over an ancient civilization. Their purpose was artificial, created by human hands to guard against intrusion. But the desert holds other guardians too, older ones, whose purpose was not crafted by any architect, but born from a world in crisis. Deep within the sands of the desert resort, buried beneath layers of time and ruin, there is a shrine. It is not dedicated to a sword, nor to a stone carving, but to a creature that once did something no other Pokémon could, a creature that became a sun. The legend of Volcarona and its role as a literal savior of the world is one of the most haunting stories in Unova's history. It speaks of a time when the sun itself was blotted out. Some say it was the result of a volcanic winter, a catastrophic eruption that cast a veil of ash across the sky. Others whisper of a great darkness that swallowed the light. Whatever the cause, the world grew cold, plants withered. Pokémon that depended on warmth and photosynthesis began to fade. Entire ecosystems teetered on the edge of collapse, and in that frozen twilight, there was no hope. But from the depths of a desert, a single Volcarona emerged. Its wings blazed with an internal fire so intense that they radiated light and heat across the land. It flew high above the clouds, spreading its flames like a beacon, and in doing so, it became a substitute for the missing sun. The world warmed again, life returned, and the people of that ancient era, those who survived, carved a shrine into the sand in its honor. Now, this is a very different kind of protection than what the Swords of Justice offered. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion defended with steel and will. They fought directly against humans who encroached upon the wild. Their power was aggressive, a barrier of force. But Volcarona's presence was not a wall, it was a hearth. It did not stand between danger and the weak. Instead, it provided the very conditions necessary for life to continue. Its protection was not a shield, but a warmth. Not a sword, but a light. Where the Swords of Justice guarded by repelling threats, Volcarona guarded by sustaining existence. One is a guardian of action, the other a guardian of survival. And in the desert resort, these two philosophies quietly intersect. The relic castle, where Volcarona is honored, is also a place where Sigilifs still hover. The ancient city beneath the dunes once held both the artificial sentinels and the memory of the living sun. It is a junction where the constructed and the natural, the aggressive and the nurturing, meet in the sand. Think of that deep, dry heat of the desert. You walk through the ruins. The wind shifts the dunes. Above, a Volcarona may flutter, its wings casting an orange glow that mimics the very sun it once replaced. And somewhere in the distance, the Swords of Justice roam, their purpose never to heal, only to defend. Two visions of guardianship, born from the same land, yet so different in their essence. But the desert is not the only place where elemental forces hold sway. Beyond the dunes, beyond the relic castle, there are other powers, wild, untamable, and far less benevolent. They do not protect, they do not sustain, they bring chaos. And in our next chapter, we will turn to the storms that rage across Unova itself. We will face the untamed winds, the crackling thunder, and the earth-shattering force of the forces of nature. For where there is order, there must also be chaos. The question is who or what stands between them. Volcarona's role as a sun substitute was a solitary act of preservation, a single being taking on the weight of an entire world's survival. That kind of guardianship is deliberate, self-sacrificing, and tied to a fixed duty. But in Unova, there exists another kind of power, one that doesn't stand guard over anything. It doesn't protect, it doesn't promise, it simply is. The forces of nature are not guardians in the way the Swords of Justice understand the word. They are the raw, untamed expression of the world's chaos, and that makes them the perfect foil to everything Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion and Keldeo stand for. Where the swords are deliberate, the forces of nature are capricious. Where the swords act with moral clarity, the forces act with elemental indifference. Tornadus, Thundurus and Landorus are not protectors of Pokémon habitats. They are not motivated by justice or truth or ideals. They are storms given form. Tornadus, the cyclone Pokémon, sweeps across the Unovan countryside with a whimsy that borders on malice. Its Pokédex entries speak of it destroying homes, scattering entire herds of Pokémon for the sheer thrill of the wind. Thundurus, the bolt-strike Pokémon, flies through the clouds, sending down bolts of lightning that can strike the earth dozens of times before its flight path even changes. These are not beings you reason with. You don't plead your case to a thunderstorm. But then there is Landorus. Landorus is the third member, the mediator, and in many ways the most fascinating because it introduces the concept of balance to a trio that otherwise seems defined by chaos. Landorus is known as the abundance Pokémon. Its very presence is said to enrich the soil, to bring fertility to the land, to calm the raging winds and lightning that its partners unleash. Landorus acts as a regulator. It doesn't stop the storms entirely, but it tempers them. It ensures that the destruction Tornadus and Thundurus cause does not spiral into total collapse. In a world where two beings of pure chaos roam freely, Landorus is the hand that steers them away from the edge of apocalypse. This is where the philosophical clash becomes unavoidable. The Swords of Justice impose order through discipline. They train, they plan, they adhere to a code. Keldeo's entire arc is about learning when to strike and when to hold back, about mastering the self to master the battle. The forces of nature operate on a completely different axis. They don't need to learn anything. They don't evolve. They don't grow. Tornadus and Thundurus are not evil. They are pre-moral. They do what the wind does, what the lightning does. And Landorus is not a hero in the way Cobalion is a hero. Landorus does not choose to protect the weak. It chooses to maintain equilibrium. And that equilibrium sometimes means letting villages be flooded so that the skies don't tear open permanently. And yet, Unova's folklore treats them as a necessary part of the world. The swords are celebrated in statues and songs. The forces of nature are feared, respected, and often prayed to. You don't pray to Cobalion for a good harvest. You pray to Landorus. You don't ask Terrakion to stop a hurricane. You ask Landorus to steer it away. The relationship is one of checks and balances. It's a messy, unpredictable system. The swords represent a form of justice that is earned through hardship and sacrifice. The forces represent a form of order that is imposed through raw power and cosmic indifference. Now consider what happens when that power is no longer bound by even Landorus's mediation. Consider what happens when someone tries to take control of the storms, instead of simply appeasing them. In the Unova region, there is a story that has never been fully told in the games, but it is hinted at in the anime, in side content, and in the very design of these Pokémon. It is a story of a crisis, one where the balance between chaos and order tips so dangerously that the region itself nearly collapses. That story is often called the Unova survival crisis, and it is the moment when the Swords of Justice and the forces of nature, for all their differences, are forced to confront the same enemy. Landorus, the mediator of chaos, had always been the third point in an unstable triangle. But what happens when that triangle is broken? When the mediator is absent, and the two forces of destruction run wild without restraint? The answer is a crisis that nearly erased Unova from the map. And it was not a myth from ancient texts or a distant legend. It happened within the living memory of the anime, in a two-part episode that still sends chills through the fandom when we revisit it. Team Rocket, in perhaps their most ambitious and dangerous scheme, managed to seize control of Tornadus and Thundurus. They did not need to capture them outright. They only needed to corrupt their will. Using technology that amplified the Pokémon's natural rage, they turned the forces of nature into living weapons. Tornadus whipped up cyclones that tore through the skies, while Thunderous summoned lightning storms that blackened the heavens. Together they created a maelstrom so vast that the very geography of Unova began to warp. Cities were battered, forests were flattened, and the ocean churned with waves that threatened to swallow the coastline. This was not a localized incident. This was an extinction-level event unfolding in real time. The anime shows us panicked crowds, trembling Pokémon, and a sky so dark that day turned into an endless twilight. And at the center of it all, Team Rocket stood laughing, believing they had finally achieved the ultimate power over nature itself. But nature does not bow to human ambition for long. Enter Meloetta, the Melody Pokémon. At first glance, Meloetta seems an unlikely savior. She is small, delicate, and her primary power is her voice, a song that can soothe hearts and awaken a sense of wonder. But in this crisis, her song became the key to restoring balance. When Meloetta began to sing, her voice cut through the roar of the storms. It was a frequency that resonated not with the chaos, but with the core of the forces of nature. Tornadus and Thunderous, driven mad by Team Rocket's control, paused. Their rampage faltered. They seemed to listen. Yet Meloetta alone could not end the crisis. Her song could calm, but it could not command. The true intervention came from the region's legendary balance, in the form of Landorus. When Meloetta's melody reached its peak, Landorus descended from the clouds, no longer a mere mediator, but an active enforcer. He challenged the other two. And in that confrontation, a transformation occurred. Tornadus and Thunderous shifted from their incarnate forms into their Therian forms. Surrendering to Landorus's dominance, the storms ceased. The sky cleared. Balance was restored, not through destruction, but through an ancient hierarchy reasserting itself. And here we must ask the question that haunts this chapter. Where were the swords of justice during this global threat? The answer lies in the nature of their guardianship. Cabalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo are protectors of Pokémon from human encroachment, from the slow poison of habitat destruction, from the fires that burn away homes. They are not arbiters of natural disasters. They are not the curators of elemental balance. The tempest that Tornadus and Thunderous unleashed was a force of nature, not a crime of exploitation. It was chaos, but it was primal chaos, the kind that has always been mediated by Landorus and his kind. The swords of justice do not fight against storms. They fight against the hands that light the match. And in this crisis, the hands were Team Rocket's, but the weapon was the very fabric of weather itself. That battle belonged to a different order of legendaries. So they remained in the shadows, watching, perhaps waiting, but never stepping into the arena. Their absence was not neglect. It was the quiet acknowledgement that some conflicts are not meant for their swords. When the crisis ended, Unova began to rebuild, but the memory of that near annihilation lingered, and it raised a deeper question. If the swords of justice do not intervene when the world is nearly destroyed by legendary forces, when exactly do they draw their blades? The answer will come, as it always does, when the threat becomes personal, when the enemy is not a storm, but a bulldozer, not a lightning bolt, but a fence, not a cyclone, but a fire set by human hands. That is the moment the sacred swords step forward, and that story, the one that defines their entire purpose, is waiting for us in the chapter ahead. We call it the human encroachment, and it is the reason they exist at all. In the wake of the Unova crisis, where the forces of nature threatened to tear the region apart, one might assume the greatest danger to the land had passed. But long before Tornadus and Thunderous stirred the skies, a quieter, more insidious force had already begun reshaping Unova. Not a storm, not a legendary battle, but the slow, deliberate march of humanity itself. To understand the swords of justice, we must first understand the world they rose to protect, and the world that pushed them into shadow. Unova, as we know it today, is a land of gleaming skylines and sprawling urban grids, but it was not always so. Before the first steel beam of Castelia City was driven into the earth, the region was a tapestry of ancient forests, misty moors, and untouched wilderness. The earliest human settlers arrived not as conquerors, but as explorers. They built small villages along the coasts, trading with the Pokémon that shared their territory. For generations, there was balance. The wild places were vast enough for both human and Pokémon to thrive. Then came the Industrial Revolution. In Unova's history, this was not a slow evolution, it was an explosion. The discovery of coal and mineral deposits beneath the eastern plains ignited a fervor of mining and manufacturing. Within decades, the quiet village of Castelia swelled into a metropolis, its skyline rising like a steel forest, its docks choking the bay with cargo ships. And with each new building, each new road, the wilderness retreated. Forests were felled, wetlands drained. The Moor of Icyrus, once a sprawling sanctuary for countless species, was carved into pockets of remaining land, hemmed in by railways and power plants. This was the world that birthed the Swords of Justice, not as symbols of nobility, but as desperate guardians pushed to the brink. The Pokédex entries of Cobalion, Terrakion and Virizion carry an unmistakable tone of bitterness. Cobalion's entry in Pokémon Black states that it has a stern disposition and will never forgive those who would hurt Pokémon. In Pokémon White, it is said to have led a group of Pokémon that fled a massive fire in a forest. That fire, the Great Moor Fire, was no natural disaster. It was a consequence of human carelessness, perhaps arson, perhaps an industrial accident. But the result was the same, a raging inferno that swept through the moors of Icyrus, consuming everything in its path. In the aftermath, the swords did not simply retreat, they hid. Terrakion's Pokédex entry reveals that it smashes through obstacles with immense power, but also that it does not have any compassion for humans who trample on the natural world. Virizion's entry goes further, stating that it cuts through the hearts of those who would harm the forest. These are not neutral protectors. They are resentful, wounded, and deeply distrustful of the species that forced them into isolation. The construction of Castelia City, in particular, was the tipping point. As the city expanded, swallowing the pinwheel forest edges, the swords retreated deeper into the remaining wilderness. They became legends, not because they were rarely seen, but because they deliberately avoided human contact. But why did they stay at all? Why not simply flee the region? The answer lies in their role as guardians of the Pokémon that could not leave. The orphans, the injured, the young, these were the ones they protected. Keldeo, found in the ashes of the Moor Fire, was just one of many, and so the swords forged a silent pact. They would remain in the shadows, watching, waiting, ready to act if human encroachment ever crossed a line again. Their resentment was not hatred, it was grief. Grief for a world that had been paved over, and a quiet vow never to let it happen again. This tension between progress and preservation is what makes the Swords of Justice so compelling. They are not villains, nor are they passive. They are sentinels of a lost era, forever shaped by the very colonization they fought against. And as we'll see in the next chapter, their legacy may extend far beyond what the history books record. In fact, there is a theory that they were not born heroes, but made into them through a bond of apprenticeship, a bond that could change everything we think we know about their origin. That is the apprenticeship theory, and it holds secrets that even the eldest Unovan myths have forgotten. The previous chapter left us standing in the shadow of Castelia City's skyline, watching the Swords of Justice retreat deeper into the wilderness as human industry swallowed the land. That story of retreat and displacement raises a question that has haunted fans for over a decade. Were Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo simply local heroes bound to Unova's forests and moors, or were they part of something far larger, a network of guardians that spans the entire Pokémon world? This is where the apprenticeship theory enters the conversation. It is one of the most persistent and compelling fan theories in the community, and it asks us to look beyond Unova's borders. The theory proposes that the Swords of Justice are not the apex of their own legend, but rather apprentices, or perhaps successors, to an older, more cosmic hierarchy of guardians. The evidence for the swords being part of a larger cosmic hierarchy is scattered across multiple generations of games, and it begins with a name that echoes from the far north of Sinnoh, Regigigas. Regigigas, the colossal Pokémon, is said to have pulled continents into place with its immense strength. In the lore of Generation 4, Regigigas created the three legendary golems, Regish, Redrock and Registeel, to serve as its servants and guardians. But here is where the theory takes its first step. If Regigigas could create a trio of guardians to serve a specific purpose, what if other ancient beings did the same? What if the Swords of Justice were, in a sense, the Unovan equivalent of the Regi trio, crafted or chosen by a higher power to protect the region's balance? The theory draws a direct parallel between the structure of the Regi trio and the Swords of Justice. Both are groups of three primary members, with a fourth that appears later or is considered an apprentice. In the Regi case, Regigigas is the master and the three golems are its tools. In the Swords case, the theory suggests that Cobalion, Terrakion and Virizion were trained or empowered by a legendary Pokémon that has not yet been fully revealed in the games, perhaps are being tied to the very concept of justice or protection. Keldeo, then, is the apprentice of the apprentices, the youngest member learning from the trio, just as the trio itself learned from an older master. But the theory does not stop at Regigigas. It expands to include other regional trios, such as the late guardians of Sinnoh, Uxie, Mesprit and Azelf, who were created by Arceus to give humans knowledge, emotion and willpower. It even touches on the forces of nature we discussed in earlier chapters, Tornadus, Thundurus and Landorus, who maintain the elemental balance of the skies. The idea is that every region has a guardian network, a set of legendary Pokémon that operate on a similar principle of three, with a fourth or a master figure overseeing them. Unova's Swords of Justice, in this framework, are simply one iteration of a universal pattern. Evaluating fan theories linking the swords to Regigigas and other regional trios requires us to examine the evidence carefully. The most compelling piece of evidence is the timing of their appearances in the games. In Pokémon Black and White, swords are encountered in the post-game after the player has already dealt with the Tau trio and the region's main conflict. This placement suggests they are not central to Unova's primary legend, but rather a side story, a hint at a deeper layer of lore. Similarly, the Regi trio in Hoenn and Sinnoh are often hidden away in remote locations, requiring complex puzzles to access, as if they are waiting for a worthy trainer to uncover their secret. Another piece of evidence lies in the sword's design and abilities. Each sword is based on a musketeer, but their typing, fighting in grass or rock or water does not align with any obvious elemental theme. This lack of a clear elemental pattern has led some theorists to suggest that their typing is secondary to their role as protectors. They are not guardians of fire or ice or thunder, but guardians of a concept, justice, and that concept is universal. If the swords are part of a larger cosmic hierarchy, then their purpose is not tied to any single region, but to the protection of Pokémon everywhere from human encroachment. But is there a global guardian network that transcends the Unova borders? The games themselves provide tantalizing hints. In Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, the swords can be found in various locations, but they are also linked to the Abyssal Ruins, an ancient underwater structure that contains inscriptions in a forgotten language. Those inscriptions speak of a great king and a great war, and some fans have interpreted them as evidence of a prehistoric civilization that once controlled or communicated with legendary Pokémon across the world. If such a network existed, the swords could have been its enforcers, traveling between regions to maintain order. The theory gains even more traction when we consider the anime. In the Best Wishes series, the swords appear as protectors of a forest, but they are also shown to have a connection to the legendary Pokémon of other regions. In one episode, Cobalion is seen standing atop a cliff, gazing out at the ocean, as if it is watching for threats from beyond Unova. This imagery, subtle as it is, suggests that the swords are aware of a larger world and their place within it. Yet, for all its elegance, the apprenticeship theory remains unconfirmed by official sources. Game Freak has never explicitly stated that the swords are part of a global network, and the lore of each region is often self-contained. The Regi trio, for example, is tied to Unsina, not to Unova. The forces of nature are explicitly Unovan, with no known counterparts in other regions. The theory is a beautiful construction of fan speculation, a way to connect the dots that the games leave scattered. But that is the beauty of Pokémon lore. The gaps are intentional. They invite us to imagine what lies beyond the edges of the map, to wonder if the Swords of Justice are merely the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. As we stand here, looking out at the vast ocean of Unova's history, we cannot help but feel that there is more to come, that the story of the swords is not yet complete, and that feeling will only grow stronger as we turn our attention to the very foundation of Unova's identity. The ancient conflict that split a single dragon into three. The tale of truth and ideals that defines the region's soul. That is the story of Black and White. The great schism that changed everything. The previous chapter explored the tantalizing possibility of a global guardian network, one that might connect the Swords of Justice to ancient titans like Regigigas, stretching across regions like a hidden web of protectors. But if such a network exists, it would have to contend with the most profound fracture in Unova's own history. A schism not of stone or steel, but of belief. This is the great divide between truth and ideals. The two forces that once shattered the original dragon and set the entire region on a collision course with destiny. And for the Swords of Justice, this philosophical war would reshape their very relationship with humanity. When you first journey through Unova in the original Black and White games, you are asked to make a choice that defines your entire experience. Do you pursue the Dragon of Truth, Reshiram, or the Dragon of Ideals, Zekrom? That choice determines the legendary you capture, the final battle you face, and the ideological flavour of your victory. But it also determines something subtler. The kind of world the Swords of Justice are sworn to protect. In a world where truth prevails, humanity is guided by honesty and clarity. Perhaps a world where the swords could find common ground with those who never deceive. In a world of ideals, where dreams and aspirations reign, the swords might see a humanity worth defending, one striving for a better future. Yet both versions of Unova are still scarred by the same past. The Maw of Iciris Fire was not caused by a single philosophy. It was caused by greed and fear, which can fester under any banner. The game's narrative never directly shows the swords reacting to your choice of legendary. But the implication lingers. The sacred guardians exist outside the human conflict, yet they cannot escape its consequences. After all, it was human expansion, driven by ideals of progress and industry, that burned their home. So when the sequel games, Black 2 and White 2, arrived 2 years later, a quiet revolution took place in how these legendary protectors were encountered. In the originals, finding them required patience and exploration in the post-game, often in hidden corners of the region, like Pinwheel Forest or Route 11. They were elusive, almost ghost-like. But in Black 2 and White 2, they become more accessible, still challenging, but now appearing in clearer locations, and with a narrative reason for their presence. Why the shift? At the time of the sequels, the swords had begun to trust humans again. This change did not happen overnight. It was forged in the crucible of the Neo Team Plasma era, when a new generation of would-be conquerors twisted the language of liberation into a tool of oppression. Getsis, the mastermind who wore the mask of idealism, had fallen in the first games, but his influence lingered. Neo Team Plasma rose from the ashes, wielding stolen Pokémon and ancient legends to justify a new order. They spoke of returning Pokémon to their natural state. Their actions told a different story. They captured the Swords of Justice, or at least tried to wield their legend as symbols of a righteous cause. But the real swords watched from the shadows. It was during this crisis that the quartet saw something they had not witnessed in centuries. Humans fighting on behalf of Pokémon, not against them. The player character, the hero of Black 2 and White 2, allied with a redeemed N and the remnants of the original Team Plasma to stop Getsis. They proved that humanity could change, that the same species which once lit the Iciris fires could also extinguish them. And so, the swords began to emerge from their hiding places. Cobalion, Terrakion and Verigeron allowed themselves to be found, to be challenged, and ultimately to be befriended. They accepted that not every human was an enemy. This trust was fragile, but it was a start. The great schism, then, is not just between truth and ideals. It is the rift between the old world of fear and the new possibility of partnership. The player's choice in the original games influenced the philosophical backdrop, but the sequels showed that action speaks louder than creed. The swords did not care which dragon you caught. They cared that you stood beside them when the flames of injustice rose again. And what of Keldeo, the youngest member of the group? It was during this era that Keldeo truly proved itself, mastering the secret sword and evolving into its resolute form. But that mastery came through a trial, a test of its own resolve, a trial that would force the young colt to face its deepest fears and prove worthy of the legacy it inherited. That story, the story of how Keldeo earned its place among the sacred swords, is a crucible we have yet to explore. It is called the Trial of the Three, and when we step into that forgotten arena, the meaning of true guardianship will be tested to its breaking point. The choice you made in Black and White, truth or ideals, did not just shape the fate of Reshiram and Zekrom, it quietly redrew the map of Unova itself. And nowhere is that shift felt more intimately than in the post-game. In the original games, once you had defeated the Elite Four and become champion, the world opened up, but it did so in a way that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. The swords of justice were not waiting for you at the end of a cave with a simple battle. They demanded a trial, and that trial began with a place called the Guidance Chamber. Deep beneath the earth, hidden in the twisting tunnels of the Relic Passage or the labyrinthine roots of Pinwheel Forest, you would find a stone chamber. The walls were smooth, ancient, carved not by Pokémon but by hands long forgotten. At the center stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal, a single stone. Touching it triggered no battle, no cutscene, just a quiet hum, and then the chamber would reveal its secret. A path had opened elsewhere, a path that led to another chamber, the Trial Chamber. This was not a dungeon you could brute force. It was a puzzle of patience and exploration. The Guidance Chamber served as the first step in what the game called the Trial of the Three. If you wanted to capture Cobalion, Terrakion, or Verigeron, you had to prove you could find them. No markers on the map, no NPC giving you direct coordinates. The Guidance Chamber simply whispered where they were hiding. By unlocking a new area in the world, in Black and White, the order was fixed. You encountered Cobalion first in the Guidance Chamber, then it fled to the Trial Chamber in a remote corner of the region. The mechanic was elegant. It forced you to roam Unova with a purpose, to explore every route and cave you might have ignored during the main story. But there was more to it than gameplay. The environment itself told you a story about isolation. Each of the three swords was found in a location that felt abandoned, cut off from the bustling cities and routes. Cobalion waited in a cave deep in the maw of Iciris, a place scarred by the same fire that forged its legend. Terrakion made its home in the rugged, barren cliffs of Route 22, a path that led nowhere except to a dead end and a silent sentinel. Verigeron chose the serene, overgrown ruins of the Pledge Grove, a place that felt like a forgotten sanctuary. These were not random encounters. They were deliberate retreats. Think about what that means. The Swords of Justice had once protected the Pokémon of Unova from human encroachment, leading them to safety during the Iciris fire. After that, they withdrew. They did not stay in the open. They sealed themselves away in remote chambers, accessible only to those who understood the Guidance Chamber's message. The isolation was not punishment, it was preservation. They were waiting, but not for just any trainer. They were waiting for someone who would respect their purpose. Someone who would not simply capture them for sport, but would understand the weight of their vow. That is why the mechanics of capture feel so deliberate in the original games. You could not throw a master ball and call it done. Well, you could, but the journey itself was the point. You had to traverse the entire region, sometimes backtracking across routes you had visited 100 times, only to find a new doorway that had been there all along. The trial chamber was not a boss arena, it was a proving ground, and each sword, when you finally faced it, would not flee. It stood its ground, as if acknowledging that you had earned the right to test its strength. In Black 2 and White 2, the trial changed. The guidance chamber was gone, replaced by simpler encounter methods. The swords were still hidden, but you could find them earlier, and the narrative of their isolation softened. Some saw that as a loss. The original trial felt like a rite of passage, a quiet pilgrimage that tied you directly to the law of the forest fire and the Guardian's retreat. When you stood in the guidance chamber, you were not just solving a puzzle, you were stepping into the same stone hall where the swords themselves had once gathered to plan the evacuation of the Pokémon. The walls held that history. And then, there was the matter of the fourth sword, the one who never had a trial of his own. Keldeo, the colt who had been orphaned in the moors of Osiris Ashes, had trained under the trio, learned the secret sword, and evolved into his resolute form. But in the original games, you could not capture Keldeo in the wild. You had to bring it to the Pledge Grove with the trio in your party to unlock its full potential. That grove was the same place where Virizion waited, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to whisper the legend of the fire. The environment was not just a backdrop, it was memory. So when you finally captured Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion, you had completed a journey that was as much about understanding as it was about collection. The trial of the three taught you that some legends cannot be rushed. They require a guide, a chamber that points the way, a path that tests your resolve, and a silence that tells you exactly how long these guardians have been waiting. But what about the dragon that waited in the frozen ends of Unova? What about the icy blade that had been shattered? The one that Keldeo would one day challenge. That is a story that begins not with a trial, but with a fracture. And in the next chapter, we will step into the abyss of Kyurem and the Frozen Blade. Chapter 19, Kyurem and the Frozen Blade. After navigating the trial chamber and the guidance chamber in the games, after following the footsteps that lead a trainer from one relic statue to the next, we now turn to a different kind of trial. One that was brought to life not through code and capture mechanics, but through animation, a test of courage so stark that it would pit the youngest of the Swords of Justice against the coldest dragon ever to haunt the White Ruins, the withered dragon itself, Kyurem. To understand the relationship between this frozen remnant and the four protectors of Unova, we have to first understand what Kyurem actually is. It is not merely another legendary Pokémon, it is a husk, the shell left behind when the original dragon split into Reshiram and Zekrom, representatives of truth and ideals. Kyurem holds no truth and no ideals, only the emptiness of what was lost. That emptiness is expressed as infinite cold, a desperate hunger to become whole again, and that hunger brought it into direct conflict with the Swords of Justice. Nowhere is this conflict explored more deeply than in the 2012 film. It is a film that extends the lore of Unova in a very specific way. It shows us that the swords are not just static guardians hiding in forests or caves. They are active teachers, and they are, for the first time, shown to be imperfect. The movie centers on Keldeo, the youngest and most eager of the group, and his recklessness sets in motion a confrontation that forces the entire team to face a threat unlike any they had ever known. The movie opens with the trio, Cobalion, Terrakion and Virizion, training Keldeo in the secret sword technique. They are preparing him to take his place among them as a fully fledged Sword of Justice. But Keldeo is impatient. He wants his chance to prove himself not by studying, but by winning. And what better way to prove strength than by challenging the strongest dragon in Unova? That dragon was Kyurem, a being so powerful that it could freeze time and space around it. A creature that lived in a glacier, a monster of absolute zero. Keldeo sneaks away from his mentors and travels to the giant chasm, the frozen crater where Kyurem dwells. It is a place of silence and bitter wind, where even the air feels solid with cold. And there he issues his challenge. The test of courage becomes a duel between an apprentice who believes he is ready and a dragon that has long since stopped caring about anything but filling its inner void. For Kyurem, this challenge is not a test, but an opportunity. A chance to absorb the energy of a legendary Pokémon and grow stronger, perhaps even to reclaim some of the power it lost. The duel is devastating. Keldeo fights with passion, with speed, with the technique he had practiced for so long. But Kyurem is not just a physical force. It wields an ice that burns, a cold that can shatter stone. It uses a move called Glaciate, which freezes the very ground, and then follows up with its signature technique, the Freeze Shock, a physical manifestation of absolute zero. Keldeo is overpowered. He is pinned, frozen, and nearly captured. And that is when the true relationship between the withered dragon and the swords of justice becomes clear. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion arrive not as a rescue party but as a last stand. They stand between Kyurem and their fallen pupil, ready to sacrifice themselves. In that moment, Kyurem is shown not as a mindless beast, but as something more tragic. A thing that wants to complete itself, even if that means breaking the bonds that hold the swords together. The movie portrays Kyurem's loneliness, its frozen heart, but also its willingness to destroy everything in its path. The swords of justice represent warmth, community, and purpose. Kyurem represents isolation, emptiness, and desperation. It is a beautiful, cold contrast. But the test of courage does not end with Kyurem's victory. Keldeo, after being freed by his friends, realizes that true courage is not about winning the first battle. It is about learning from defeat, about facing the same terror again, with wisdom instead of arrogance. He returns to the giant chasm, now wielding the full power of Secret Sword, the technique he had only partially mastered before. In the final confrontation, Keldeo evolves into his resolute form, his horn glowing with the light of a blade that can cut through ice itself. And he does something that even the strongest dragon may not have expected. He offers Kyurem a choice: fight to the end or stand down. Kyurem, for all its power, cannot break the will of a sword of justice, who has truly unlocked his courage. The duel ends with a truce, not a victory, not a capture, but a mutual acknowledgement. Kyurem retreats into its glacier, and Keldeo earns his place among the three, no longer an apprentice but a peer. Analysing this film as a lore extension, that it fills a gap the games left empty. In the games, Kyurem is simply a legendary you can encounter in the giant chasm, a static encounter with no connection to the swords of justice. The movie gives them a shared history. It tells us that the swords are not just protectors of Pokémon. They are preservers of balance, even against the fractured remnants of the original dragon. And it shows that Kyurem, too, is part of Unova's ecosystem of legend, a creature that represents the danger of incompleteness, the ache of what is missing. The relationship between the withered dragon and the swords is therefore one of opposition, but also one of reflection. Kyurem lacks what the swords embody, purpose beyond survival, and the swords, through their confrontation with Kyurem, learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face something that could destroy you and still stand firm. With that duel behind us, we begin to see Unova not as a collection of isolated legends, but as a tapestry where each story weaves into the next. And the next chapter of that tapestry takes us out of the frozen past and into the present day, where these ancient tales are reborn in a world that has almost forgotten them. The modern mythos is waiting, and it has its own secrets to reveal. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. After the events of Curin versus the Sword of Justice, the legend of the quartet had been broadcast across the entire Unova region in a way it never had before. The movie, with its dramatized retelling of Keldeo's journey and the battle against the frozen dragon, earned the Swords of Justice into household names overnight. But here's the strange thing. The more people talked about them, the more the truth of their history began to blur. The real story of the Maw of Osiris Fire, the rescue of hundreds of Pokémon, and the training of an orphaned Keldeo became a kind of folklore that shifted with each telling. By the time the 2020s rolled around, the Swords of Justice were no longer remembered as historical figures. They had become cryptids. Think about that word for a moment. Cryptids are creatures whose existence is debated, whose sightings are rare and unconfirmed. The Loch Ness Monster, the Mothman, the Chupacabra. These are beings that live on the edge of belief. And in modern Unova, that is exactly what Cabalion, Terrakion, Verizion and Keldeo have become. The public no longer points to old ruins or ancient texts as proof of their existence. Instead, they trade blurry photographs and whispered accounts from hikers who claim to have seen a flash of metal in the forests of Pinwheel or a shimmer of green near the moor. The transition from revered guardians to whispered legends is not a fall from grace. It is a natural consequence of a world that has moved on. Consider the veteran NPCs of the games, those tough, wandering trainers who appear on Route 11 or near the Maw of Osiris. They speak with a certain gravity about the old stories. They tell you about the day the forest burned, about the 3 swords that drove the humans back, about the small apprentice who later stood alongside them. But these veterans are relics themselves. They are the last generation to have heard the account directly from grandparents or great-grandparents who lived through the events. As they age and fade, the oral tradition weakens. The stories become second-hand, then third-hand, then legend. And with each retelling, the details morph. The fire grows bigger, the swords become sharper, the timing becomes uncertain, the line between fact and myth erodes. This is where the concept of the cryptid takes hold, because when something is not actively seen for decades, the mind fills the void with wonder. The Swords of Justice are now whispered about in online forums, where people compare theories about their whereabouts. Some claim they have moved deep into the giant chasm, avoiding contact entirely. Others say they have split up, each guarding a different corner of Unova. The most romantic versions of the modern mythos insist that Keldeo still searches for his mentors, forever the wandering apprentice, looking for the family he lost. These stories are not supported by evidence, but they do not need to be. They serve a purpose. They keep the memory alive. And that memory has a specific geography. The Maw of Osiris, once a scarred patch of ash and sorrow, has become a pilgrimage site for those who believe. You can find makeshift shrines there, stones stacked in patterns that mimic the 4 swords, ribbons tied to the reedwoods, offerings of mystical herbs left by visitors hoping for a sign. The veterans who still live nearby do not dismiss these pilgrims. They welcome them, because they understand that the story of the Swords of Justice is no longer about what happened in the past. It is about what the people of Unova need to believe in the present. In a region so defined by progress and industry, by the towering skyline of Castelia and the sprawling bridges of the sky, the idea of 4 silent protectors living just beyond the reach of civilization is a comfort. It whispers that the world is still wild, that nature has its champions, that there is justice beyond human law. The Swords of Justice have become symbols more than beings. They are the ghost story that reminds you that the woods are not empty. They are the old photograph that might show a shadow where no shadow should be. They are the cryptids of a modern age that desperately wants to believe in something older, and as the final veterans pass on their knowledge, the torch is carried by another group, the next generation of storytellers, the ones who will shape how the swords are remembered in the centuries to come. But that is a question of legacy that ties directly into how these guardians interact with the very elements they once protected, because the fire of the moor was not the only force they faced. There is a deeper, older power that flows through Unova's landscape, a synergy of energy that may determine whether the swords of justice remain hidden legends or step back into the light. That is where our next chapter takes us, into the concept of elemental balance and the forces that bind these warriors to the land itself. Chapter 21 is called Elemental Synergy, and it will show you that the story of the Swords of Justice is far from finished. From the shadows of modern folklore, where the Swords of Justice have faded into whispered cryptid sightings, we turn now to the very essence of their power, the element that binds them together across time and battle. 4 legendary Pokémon, each wielding a different primary type: steel, rock, grass, water. Yet they all share one common thread, one martial echo that defines their identity as the sacred swords. That thread is the fighting type. Why fighting? It's not merely a gameplay convenience, not a random design choice to give them a shared weakness to flying and psychic moves. The fighting type, in the world of Pokémon, represents discipline, physical mastery, and the spirit of the warrior. It's the type of those who train their bodies to become weapons, who rely on precision and willpower rather than raw elemental fury. And when you look at the Swords of Justice, modelled after the 3 Musketeers plus their apprentice, the fighting type becomes their silent oath. Let's break down what this means on a technical level. Every Sword of Justice has a secondary fighting typing, and the leader is steel and fighting, a combination that speaks to iron will and unbreakable composure. Terrakion is rock and fighting, raw power chiseled from the earth. Virizion, the swift one, is grass and fighting, grace and nature woven into combat. And Keldeo, the youngest, is water and fighting, flow adapting to the moment, then striking with sudden force. That shared fighting type gives them a unified weakness to psychic, flying and fairy moves, yes, but more importantly, it gives them a common access to moves like Sacred Sword, Close Combat and Brick Break. Their signature move, Sacred Sword, ignores the target's stat changes, cutting through illusion and defense alike, a fitting technique for guardians who fight not for glory but for justice. But the deeper reason lies in the inspiration behind their designs. The 3 Musketeers were not just swashbuckling adventurers. They were masters of the blade, trained in the arts of fencing and combat. The fighting type in Pokémon is explicitly tied to martial arts, to physical training that transcends genetic ability. Each of the Swords of Justice earned their fighting type through rigorous discipline, Cobalian's stern gaze and unwavering stance, Terrakion's explosive charges that shatter boulders, Virizion's lightning-fast kicks that blur like leaves in a storm, Keldeo's mastery of Secret Sword, which transforms water into a blade of pure determination. This is not a type they were born with, it is a type they achieved. Now consider the strategic balance of the team. On the surface, their primary types create a near-perfect defensive core. Steel resists many common attacks. Grass handles water and ground. Rock covers fire and flying. Water covers fire and rock. Together, they form a rotating shield against almost every type, except fighting itself, ironically, which is their shared weakness. But that's the point. They are a team of equals, each covering the other's flaws, each trusting the next to step in when the enemy's move lines up. The fighting type is the chain that links them, but the primary types are the individual swords in their scabbard. Steel gives Cobalion the endurance to lead. Rock gives Terrakion might to break any wall. Grass gives Virizion the speed to outmaneuver. Water gives Keldeo the flexibility to learn and adapt. Together, they form a tactical unit that trainers in the games often struggle to counter, because no single Pokémon can handle all 4 at once. You bring a flying type to handle Virizion. Terrakion's Rock Slide says otherwise. You bring a psychic type to handle Keldeo. Cobalion's Iron Head shatters that plan. The synergy is deliberate, almost musical. Each move complements the next, just as each musketeer compensated for the other's weaknesses in the original novels. but the fighting type remains the constant, the badge of their shared purpose. It is what separates them from mere elemental spirits. They are not forces of nature, like the legendary birds or the weather trio. They are warriors who trained to protect. The fighting type means they earned their legend through sweat and scars, not by birthright. And that is why, even as they fade into modern Unovan myth, their swords still carry the weight of discipline. This same discipline, this same training, might also unlock secrets buried far deeper than any battlefield. Secrets hidden beneath the scorching sands of the relic castle, where the echoes of ancient guardians whisper of a fire that predates even the swords themselves. The previous chapter explored the fighting type commonality that binds the swords of justice, the discipline and martial philosophy that makes them more than just legendary Pokémon but living embodiments of a warrior's code. That discipline, that sense of purpose, did not emerge from a vacuum. It was forged in a world that was already ancient when the swords first drew breath. And to understand that world, we must travel to a place where the sands themselves hold secrets, the desert resort, and the crumbling labyrinth beneath it, known as Relic Castle. Unova is a region of stark contrasts. In the north, the Moor of Isiris, where the great fire once raged, is a place of cold winds and damp earth. But to the south, near the heart of the region, lies an expanse of golden dunes that stretch to the horizon. The desert resort is a place of paradoxes, a tourist destination built on the edge of a wasteland, where vacationers in sunglasses walk past ruins that predate the oldest recorded history. Most visitors come for the sun and the sand. They do not come for the ghosts, but the ghosts are there. They have always been there. Beneath the shifting dunes, the Relic Castle sleeps. It is not a castle in the traditional sense. No towering spires or battlements piercing the sky. It is a subterranean necropolis, a mausoleum of a kingdom that collapsed so long ago that even its name has been forgotten. The Pokémon League records refer to it only as the Relic Castle, a placeholder for something that no one remembers. But the stones remember. The walls are lined with carvings of an ancient civilization, a people who worshipped the sun and the earth, and the creatures that walked between them. And among those carvings, if you look closely enough, you might find something familiar. Uncovering the hidden history of the desert resort and its guardian statues is not a task for the casual explorer. The castle is a maze of dead ends and collapsing floors, a place where the sand itself seems to conspire against intrusion. But those who have ventured deep enough have reported seeing statues, stone figures of Pokémon that no longer exist in the wild, guardians that once watched over the kingdom's gates. Sigalith, the ancient avian sentinels, hover in the corridors, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. They are the last remnants of that civilization's power, programmed to protect the castle from anyone who might disturb its secrets. And then there is Volcarona, at the deepest level of Relic Castle, in a chamber that feels more like a shrine than a dungeon. You can find a single Volcarona. It is not a wild encounter in the traditional sense. It is a guardian, a living torch that has burned for centuries. The Pokédex entries for Volcarona speak of a time when the sun was blotted out, when the world was plunged into an endless winter. In that darkness, a single Volcarona emerged, its fiery wings acting as a substitute for the sun itself. It saved the world, and in gratitude, the ancient kingdom built a shrine to it, deep within the castle, where it has waited ever since. But what does any of this have to do with the swords of justice? The connection is not obvious. The swords are creatures of the forest and the plains, not the desert. They are wanderers, not guardians of a single place. But the fallen kingdom of Unova, the one that built Relic Castle, was not a kingdom of humans alone. It was a kingdom of Pokémon and people living together, a symbiotic relationship that predates the modern concept of training. The statues in the castle are not just decorations, they are records. And among those records, there are hints of a different kind of warrior. Is there a connection between the swords and the fallen kingdom of Unova? The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. The Swords of Justice are not native to the Moor of Osiris. They arrived there during the fire, but they did not originate there. Their legends speak of a time before the fire, a time when they served a different purpose. Cobalion, the leader, is said to have once been the guardian of a great hall, a place where Pokémon and humans met in peace. Terrakion was a breaker of walls, a force that could shatter the barriers between worlds. Virizion was a swift messenger, a blade of wind that carried warnings across the land. And Keldeo, the youngest, was the hope of a new generation. These roles, guardian, breaker, messenger, hope, are the same roles that the statues in Relic Castle depict. The carvings show 4 figures, each wielding a blade of light, standing at the 4 corners of the kingdom. They were not just protectors, they were the kingdom's soul. And when the kingdom fell, they scattered, carrying the memory of that lost civilization into the wilderness. But there is a 5th figure in those carvings, a shadow, a blade that was never completed. The possibility of a 5th sword lost to time is a theory that has haunted Pokémon historians for years. The carvings in Relic Castle show 4 distinct figures, but there is a space between them, an empty pedestal where a 5th statue once stood. Some say it was destroyed in the fall of the kingdom. Others say it was never built, that the 5th sword was a concept that never became reality, but there are whispers, faint, almost inaudible, that the 5th sword still exists, buried deeper than any explorer has ever dared to go. It is said to be a blade of pure darkness, a sword that represents the shadow that all light must cast. It is the opposite of Keldeo's hope, the balance to the trio's virtues. The Relic Castle does not give up its secrets easily. The sand shifts, the walls crumble, and the guardians, Sigilif, Volcarona and others, do not welcome intruders. But every so often, a trainer descends into the depths, driven by a curiosity that cannot be satisfied by surface-level knowledge. They find the Volcarona, they find the carvings, and they leave with more questions than answers. The Swords of Justice are not just legends of the forest. They are echoes of a kingdom that tried to build a world where humans and Pokémon could stand side by side as equals. That kingdom failed, but its guardians did not. They adapted, they survived, and they continue to protect, even if the world they protect no longer remembers why. As the sun sets over the desert resort, casting long shadows across the dunes, the Relic Castle remains silent. The tourists pack up their umbrellas and head back to their hotels. The sand settles, and somewhere, deep beneath the surface, a 5th blade waits in the darkness, dreaming of a time when it might finally be drawn. But that is a story for another night. For now, the sands have settled, and the castle sleeps. Yet the sea is never far from Unova's shores, and in the depths of the ocean, there is a sword that has never known the touch of land. The sword of the sea waits beneath the waves, and its legend is one of solitude, of a guardian who chose to walk a path no other could follow. The statues of Relic Castle may guard the secrets of a fallen kingdom, but the true heir to Unova's coastal legacy swims in a different current entirely. Amid the stone and sand of that ancient desert, we found echoes of a protector cult, guardian shaped by human hands. But the Sword of Justice who answers to the sea was never carved from rock. Keldeo was born from fire and water, a contradiction that makes it the most elusive member of the quartet. And to understand its place in the mythos, we have to abandon the dry heat of the desert resort and follow the scent of salt spray toward Unova's eastern shore. The Moor of Osiris, where the Great Fire raged, is not a coastal region. It sits inland, a marshy expanse that once blazed with tragedy. Yet from those ashes a foal emerged, orphaned, trembling but alive. The 3 senior swords found Keldeo among the charred remains of its herd, a creature whose lineage was never grassland or mountain, but something far more fluid. The trio, each bound to a specific land-based element, grass, rock, steel, adopted a 4th who answered to water. This was not a random choice. The water typing of Keldeo is the first clue that the Swords of Justice did not simply guard the interior. They were always meant to extend their shield to the coastline, to the very border where land meets the vast Unovan Ocean. Keldeo's oceanic origins are hinted at in its very design. Its mane flows like a cresting wave, and its resolute form, unlocked when it masters the secret sword, takes on the silhouette of a breaker crashing against a cliff. The move itself, Secret Sword, is a unique water-type technique that bypasses physical defenses, striking with the force of a tidal surge. This is not a Pokémon of ponds or rivers. Keldeo is tied to the open sea, to the currents that sweep around Unova's peninsulas and into the Undella Bay that cradles the region's summer retreats. Where the trio stand firm on hills and forests, Keldeo glides between worlds, a living bridge connecting the landlocked sanctuary of the moor to the infinite horizon of the ocean. But what does it mean to be a bridge? In the lore of Unova, the Swords of Justice protect Pokémon from human encroachment. Their territory, the moor, the forests, the canyons, is inland. Yet humans have always come from the sea too. Traders, explorers, colonizers. Keldeo represents the defensive line against threats arriving on the tide. Its water typing allows it to patrol the coasts, to intercept poachers landing on beaches, to calm storms that might drive ships into nesting grounds. In that sense, Keldeo is the oceanic sentinel, the one who watches the shores while the trio watch the mountains. And this division of labor is not merely tactical, it is existential. The trio are legends, immortalized in stone and song, their images carved into the guidance chamber's walls. Keldeo, by contrast, is a myth. There is a fundamental difference between a legendary Pokémon and a mythical one, and that difference is woven into the fabric of its story. Legendaries are eternal, or at least ancient beyond memory. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Verizon have been guardians for centuries, their deeds recorded in Unovan history before the modern era. They are fixed points in the timeline, constants that can be encountered and captured in the post-game of the original Black and White. Keldeo, however, is a mythical Pokémon. It was distributed as an event, a limited-time gift, not a permanent fixture in any wild encounter outside of special raids. This ephemeral nature mirrors its narrative. Keldeo was not present at the original fire. It was born later, adopted train. Its story is one of emergence, not origin. It is a myth because its existence depends on belief, on the fulfillment of a prophecy that the trio's apprentice would one day stand beside them as an equal. And in that way, Keldeo is more human than legend. It earned its place, rather than being born into it. The ocean too is a place of becoming. Tides shift, currents change, and the sea is never static. Keldeo's habitat is not a fixed lair. It roams the coastline of Unova, appearing in legends as a fleeting silhouette against the spray. In the anime film Kyurem vs. The Sword of Justice, Keldeo's journey is one of self-discovery, of learning to control its power so it can protect a wounded friend. That friend is a fellow water type, a reminder that the sea holds its own communities of Pokémon in need of guardianship. The trio might have taught Keldeo the secret sword, but the ocean taught it resilience. And when Keldeo finally achieves resolute form, it does so by embracing the duality of its nature, a sword that strikes with the gentleness of a wave, a warrior who fights for the shore as well as the field. This oceanic bridge also connects to a deeper theme. The balance between land and sea is the balance between stability and change. The trio represent enduring principles: justice, courage, speed, while Keldeo represents adaptation. In Unova's mythology, the forces of nature are elemental chaos incarnate, and Landorus the mediator among them. The Swords of Justice are the land's answer, order through discipline. Keldeo is the answer to the sea's chaos, a disciplined fighter who can still flow like water. It is no coincidence that the relic castle, with its fallen kingdom, sits far from the coast. That kingdom collapsed because it could not adapt, because its guardians were static. Keldeo's emergence signals a new chapter in Unovan protection, one that reaches beyond the sand and into the salt. Yet not everyone sees the Swords of Justice as benevolent protectors. There are those who wish to harness their power for control, who view their legendary status as a weapon to be claimed. The sands of the relic castle whisper, of a time when humans and Pokémon warred and the kingdom fell. But a different kind of interference is brewing in the shadows of modern Unova. A movement that seeks not to honor the swords, but to bend them to its will. Team Plasma's ideology, cloaked in the rhetoric of liberation, has already drawn lines in the ground. And when the sea meets the sword, the clash between freedom and control will demand a sacrifice no statue can foresee. Keldeo's journey from a helpless orphan in the smouldering remains of the moor of Icyrus to a master of secret sword might seem like a straightforward tale of growth and redemption, but the waters of Unova run deeper than any single Pokémon story. The Swords of Justice, for all their legend, did not exist in a vacuum. They were born into a world already thick with conflict, where the very concept of Pokémon and human coexistence was being twisted into a weapon, and no one wielded that weapon more ruthlessly than the man who would one day try to turn the Guardians themselves into tools of revolution. To understand Team Plasma's interference, we have to step back from the serene forests and ancient ruins and into the cold, calculated mind of Ghetsis Harmonia. Ghetsis was never a true believer in the liberation of Pokémon. He was a pragmatist, a manipulator, who saw the deep bond between people and their partners as a weakness to be exploited. For him, the Swords of Justice were not noble protectors. They were potential trophies. They were symbols of a power that could be turned into propaganda. Imagine the gears turning in Ghetsis' head as he learned of Cobalion, Terrakion and Virizion. Here were Pokémon who had actively rejected human authority. They had led an exodus of wild Pokémon away from a burning forest. A forest that humans themselves had set ablaze either by accident or by colonial greed. The records are murky, but the intent is clear. These were Pokémon who had proven they could organize, resist and survive without human help. To Ghetsis, that independence was not a virtue to be admired. It was a template to be weaponized. He saw the swords as living proof that Pokémon did not need humans. If he could align Team Plasma's message with that ancient history, he could make the liberation movement feel inevitable, almost mythological. The swords were the perfect poster children for a cause that claimed to return Pokémon to their rightful state of freedom. In Ghetsis' speeches, the story of the Icyrus fire became a parable. Humans brought destruction, the Pokémon escaped, and the Guardians who led them were heroes not because they loved humans, but because they abandoned them. But here's where the narrative gets complicated. Ghetsis' vision of liberation was a mask. He wanted to sever the bond between people and Pokémon only so that he could control Pokémon himself, to amass an army of legends and rule Unova without opposition. The Swords of Justice, however, were not interested in being tools for any human agenda. They had spent centuries hiding from the very world that Ghetsis wanted to reshape. Their isolation was not a political statement, it was survival. This is where N enters the stage. Nor Harmonia, the boy raised by Pokémon, the empath who could hear the hearts of creatures other people could only battle. N genuinely believed that Pokémon were unhappy with humans. He saw the chains of Pokéballs as literal chains, and he wanted to set them free. His philosophy was pure, almost painfully innocent, and that purity clashed with the Swords of Justice in a way that Ghetsis never fully understood. N, when he learned of the swords, likely felt a kinship. Here were Pokémon who had chosen to live apart from humans. They had their own code, their own justice. They were living proof that Pokémon could thrive without trainers. But the swords were not activists. They were not crusaders for a global revolution. They were guardians of a specific place and time. Their isolation was defensive, not ideological. They did not want to liberate all Pokémon from all humans. They wanted to protect the few who had already been harmed. When Team Plasma's knights, the so-called Seven Sages, began searching for the Swords of Justice, they were acting on Ghetsis' orders. The attempt to weaponize these guardians was subtle at first. Rather than trying to capture them with brute force, the plan was to co-opt their story. Propaganda posters depicted Cobalion standing over a fallen trainer, its glowing horn pointed outward as if to say, "No more, Children in Team Plasma's ranks were taught that the swords were the ancestors of every wild Pokémon, that they had rejected humanity centuries ago, and that true compassion meant following their example. But the real test came when Team Plasma attempted to directly recruit or control the swords. There are fragments in the games, dialogue, and environmental clues that suggest the trio was eventually located in their hidden sanctuaries. Cobellion's cave in Pinwheel Forest, Terrakian's rugged peak, Virizian's grassy clearing, and there the philosophy of N met the reality of the swords. N, if he had stood before Cobellion, would have spoken of freedom with a gentle voice. He would have asked the Pokémon to join him, not as a servant, but as a symbol. He would have believed that the swords wanted the same world he did, a world where every Pokémon roamed free. But Cobellion, stern and silent, would have seen the humans following N. Teams of plasma grunts carrying cages, chains and machines designed to amplify a Pokémon's power. To the swords, this was not liberation. It was just a different kind of cage. There is a quiet tragedy here. The Swords of Justice represented the very ideal N claimed to fight for, Pokémon living by their own will. Yet because Ghetsis was pulling the strings, that ideal became corrupted. The swords could never trust Team Plasma. They had seen humans burn their home. They had seen humans hunt their kind. And now humans were approaching them with words of freedom, while their eyes glittered with ambition. The swords retreated further, deeper into legend, refusing to be used. Ghetsis, of course, saw this as defiance. He did not understand why the Pokémon would not accept his gift of liberation. He could not comprehend that the swords had already achieved what he claimed to want. They were free. They did not need his permission. In his frustration, Ghetsis shifted tactics. If he could not weaponize their image, he would weaponize their power indirectly. This is where the darker experiments began. The attempt to manufacture legendary control, to create artificial bonds that could override a Pokémon's will. But that is a story for another time. For now, the legacy of Team Plasma's interference is a scar on the Sword's legend. The Guardians who once acted out of pure compassion were now forced to become ghosts, hiding from a world that wanted to use them. Their isolation deepened, not because they feared all humans, but because they had learned that even well-meaning humans could be pawns of a greater deception. And what of N? He never truly met the swords face to face in the game's main narrative, but in the quiet moments when the player finds Cobellion in a lonely cave, there is a sense that this Pokémon has seen through the veil of human arguments. It knows the difference between a sincere heart and a manipulated one. It waits for a trainer who can prove their intentions, not through words, but through respect. As we move forward, the story of the Swords of Justice does not end in Unova. Their influence stretches northward into a frozen land where ancient secrets lie buried beneath ice and snow. And there a different kind of guardian waits, whose bond with the swords may rewrite everything we think we know about their origin. The Crown Tundra holds answers that the swords themselves may not have been ready to reveal. We left Team Plasma standing in the ashes of their own ambition. Ghetsis' scheme to twist the Swords of Justice into symbols of liberation lying shattered across Unova, and vision of a world where Pokémon and humans part ways forever had already clashed violently with the reality of the Sword's own history. They had never isolated themselves as mere legends waiting to be freed. They acted, they moved, they protected. And if we follow the trail of their legend beyond Unova's borders, we find something that challenges everything we thought we knew about their role as guardians. The Crown Tundra is a frozen realm at the southern tip of the Galar region, a land of biting winds, endless snow, and ancient secrets buried beneath permafrost. It was here, in the expansion known as the Crown Tundra, that trainers first encountered the Swords of Justice outside of Unova, and not as stray wanderers, but as deliberate travelers who had carved their presence into the ice. Analyzing the Sword's appearance in the Galar region's expansion forces us to reconsider their entire mythology. They did not simply drift across an ocean by accident. They chose to be there. What does their migration tell us about their role as global protectors? In Unova, the swords are rooted to a specific tragedy: the Maw of Osiris fire, the colonization of natural habitats, the guardianship of a single kingdom's vanishing wilderness. But legends that stay in one place become fossils. The Swords of Justice, by crossing into Galar, demonstrate a far wider mandate. They are not regional heroes. They are transnational agents of balance. Their presence in the Crown Tundra suggests that wherever Pokémon suffer from human encroachment, the swords will appear, even if it means crossing an ocean and adapting to a climate utterly unlike the forests of Unova. But how did they get there, and when? The footprints in the snow, tracking the legend across regional borders, becomes the detective work of the historian. In the Crown Tundra, players find Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo roaming the frozen landscape, each seeming out of place among Galarian fossils and legendary giants. Yet the snow preserves their tracks perfectly. Cloven hoofprints of the musketeer steeds, leading up mountain passes, past ancient temples, and into caves where ice drapes like curtains from a forgotten age. The timing is ambiguous, but the Galar lore suggests they arrived generations ago, perhaps during a period of climatic upheaval or human expansion into Unova's wilds. They did not come as tourists. They came as somewhere in Galar, the same pattern of destruction was repeating. The Crown Tundra itself holds a deeper irony. Galar's own legendary protectors, Zacian and Zamazenta, are also sword-wielding warriors, but their story is tied to a single kingdom and a single threat. The Swords of Justice, in contrast, are nomadic. They carry no crown, no throne, no ancestral homeland. Their only loyalty is to the principle that no habitat should be consumed by unchecked progress. In Galar, they found a region that had nearly erased its own natural spaces beneath industrial revolution. They found the same fire, just frozen, and so they left their footprints. They patrolled the Crown Tundra, a silent promise that even in the farthest reaches of the world, justice does not retire. This revelation recasts the swords not as relics of a single ancient fire, but as a species of eternal watchmen. They are as mobile as the wind, as persistent as the tide, and as unyielding as the permafrost they walk upon. But if the swords can cross oceans and appear in alien biomes, what does that mean for the stories we tell about them back in Unova? Their legacy is not a closed book. It is a living code, one that continues to write itself in new lands, new dangers, and new footprints yet to be discovered, leading us to the final chapter of their journey, where the legacy of justice will be measured not by the battles they once fought, but by the future they still guard. The Crown Tundra gave us a glimpse of these guardians, far from Unova, a migration that hinted at something larger than a simple habitat shift. When Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo appeared in the snowy wilds of Galar, they weren't just wandering aimlessly. They were carrying the weight of a legend that had outgrown its regional roots. That journey from the Maw of Osiris to a frozen foreign land marks a turning point where we stop seeing them as mere curiosities of a single generation and start recognizing them as architects of a new kind of storytelling within the Pokémon world. This is where the legacy of the Sacred Swords becomes truly visible. Before Generation 5, legendary Pokémon were often static forces of nature, the embodiments of time, space, weather, or creation itself. They existed as pillars of the universe, powerful but distant, and their stories were told through ancient texts and brief encounters. The Swords of Justice changed that. They didn't just represent an element or a concept. They represented a narrative. Their history was a story of heroism, sacrifice, and growth. A story that unfolded across the landscape of Unova and invited players to step into the role of a witness, not just a collector. You could follow their path through the burned remains of the Maw, piece together the rescue of the trapped Pokémon, and understand that these four beings had lived through trauma and triumph long before you ever encountered them. That shift in narrative style was profound. Suddenly, legendary Pokémon had backstories that felt personal, with motivations rooted in specific events. Keldeo wasn't just a mythical water type with a secret move. He was an orphan who trained under a trio of mentors, who earned his resolute form through perseverance and mastery. That character arc of growth, of mentorship, of earning your place among legends, was something the franchise had never fully explored with its rarest creatures. The swords paved the way for later legendary Pokémon who carried emotional weight. The Aura trio of Kalos with their tragic war, the Guardians of Alola with their bond to the island's ecosystem, even the hero duo of Galar with their competitive spirit. Every time a legendary Pokémon now has a defined personality, a backstory with emotional stakes, or a narrative role that isn't just "stop the evil team from using my power." You can trace that lineage back to the sacred swords. And then there's the motif itself, the musketeer inspiration. It's remarkable how deeply that cultural reference has resonated with fans. The idea of 4 warriors bound by a code, each with a distinct personality and weapon focus, taps into something timeless. The archetypal hero team, Athos, Porthos, Aramis and D'Artagnan, have been reimagined countless times in literature and film. But the Pokémon franchise gave them a new life as legendary protectors of nature. That blend of chivalric romance and ecological guardianship sparked an enduring fan appeal. You see it in the countless pieces of art, the fan theories linking them to other trios, the debates over which sword is the strongest or most noble. The musketeer motif gives them a structure that feels familiar yet fresh, and it allows fans to project their own ideas of justice onto these characters. Even the choice of fighting type as their common thread reinforces that sense of discipline and martial honor. Fighting isn't just about physical combat. It's about the will to defend, the training to overcome, and the commitment to a higher purpose. So when we consider the legacy of the Swords of Justice, we're not just talking about a quartet of Pokémon from one generation. We're talking about a turning point where legendary Pokémon became storytellers in their own right, where their histories became as important as their powers, and where a simple musical about 3 musketeers and a young water horse could inspire a decade of creative fandom. The migration to Galar was the final proof that their story wasn't confined to Unova. It had become a legend that could travel anywhere, a narrative framework that the franchise would return to again and again. But every legend must face its final test. The journey that began in the ashes of the Moor of Isirus, that stretched across 2 regions and countless encounters with trainers, is heading toward a moment of truth. The swords have proven their strength, their loyalty, and their capacity for growth. But there is one challenge they have never truly faced: confrontation. That will force them to stand together against something that threatens not just a habitat, but the very idea of justice they represent. That moment is coming, and it will be called the final stand. The legacy of the Swords of Justice is not just a story of heroism. It is a story of what happens when heroism is forced to face its own limits. We've spent so many chapters exploring how these 4 Pokémon shaped Unova's mythos, how they inspired new generations of trainers and influenced the very structure of legendary narratives in the Pokémon world. But every legend carries with it a shadow, a question that lingers at the edge of the tale. What happens if the Guardians themselves fall? Let's consider a hypothetical scenario, one that the ancient lore of Unova never recorded because it was too terrible to imagine. What if the Swords of Justice ever truly failed? Not in a single skirmish, not in a temporary setback, but a complete, irreversible collapse of their mission. The Moor of Isirus, the place where their greatest triumph occurred, would become a symbol of that failure. Imagine the Moor not as a peaceful marshland teeming with life, but as a scarred plain where the ash of that long-ago fire never fully settled. The Pokémon they rescued would have been lost. The migration routes they protected would have been severed, and the very concept of justice, embodied in their steel and their resolve, would have crumbled like burned timber. That moor, after all, is more than a battlefield. It is the birthplace of their legacy. It is where Keldeo, the youngest of the four, was found orphaned in the aftermath of the flames. The Swords of Justice did not just defeat the fire, they transformed a tragedy into a crucible. They took the ashes and forged a new protector. But if they had failed, if the fire had consumed everything and left nothing but ruin, then the Moor of Osiris would have become a graveyard, not a sanctuary. Its wetlands would have dried, its grasslands turned to dust, and the wild heart of Unova would have contracted, leaving only patches of isolated wilderness where fear replaced trust between humans and Pokémon. Yet here is the truth that Keldeo, in its long years of training, learned from its masters. The final lesson was not about how to swing a blade or how to outrun a storm. It was about the nature of failure itself. Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion. They taught Keldeo that a guardian's strength is not measured by an unbroken record of victories, but by what that guardian is willing to sacrifice in the face of defeat. The Swords of Justice did not train Keldeo to be invincible. They trained it to be resilient. They showed it that even if they themselves were to fall, even if the Moor were to burn again, the idea of justice would not die. It would pass on like a spark from one torch to another. Keldeo's resolute form is not the mark of a Pokémon that has mastered a secret technique. It is the mark of a Pokémon that has accepted the weight of its own failure as a possibility and chosen to fight anyway. So what is the ultimate fate of the Moor of Osiris? And what does it hold for Unova's wilderness? The answer lies in that very acceptance. The Moor remains a living monument to the fire that once threatened it. It is not frozen in time. It changes with every season, every rainfall, every migration. The wilderness of Unova is not static. It expands and contracts, shaped by human development and natural cycles. The Swords of Justice cannot patrol every border forever. They cannot stop every encroachment, but they have taught the Pokémon of Unova to remember. The memory of their rescue, of the fire and the flight, is woven into the genes of the wild Pokémon that inherit the Moor. That memory is a kind of eternal vigilance, and so long as that memory endures, the Swords of Justice do not need to stand forever. They have already planted the seeds of their own legacy. As we look ahead to the next chapter of this story, a chapter that will explore the concept of eternal guardians, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean for a protector to be eternal? Is it immortality? Or is it the ability to pass on the will, to protect, so that the mission continues, even when the original guardians have long since become legend themselves? The Swords of Justice may one day fade into the background of Unova's history, but the Moor will remember, and that is the only stand that truly matters. We ended the last chapter with a question that lingers like smoke over the Moor of Osiris. What happens if the Swords of Justice ever truly fail? If their blades dull, if their resolve cracks, if the fire they once contained spreads beyond control? The answer, perhaps, is not a world without guardians, but a world where the idea of justice itself becomes a fragile, contested thing, because the swords were never just for Pokémon. They were a symbol, carved into Unova's mythic bedrock, a promise that somewhere, something stands between chaos and the innocent. But here is the uncomfortable truth that the legend often glosses over. Justice is not a fixed star. It shifts with perspective, with history, with the very truths and ideals that Reshiram and Zekrom embody. The Swords of Justice acted to protect Pokémon from human encroachment. But what about the humans who saw the Moor of Osiris as a place to build homes, to feed families, to survive? In a world of conflicting truths, whose justice prevails, the swords chose the side of the wild, of the voiceless creatures that could not speak for themselves. That choice defined them, but it also placed them in a perpetual grey zone. They are not heroes in a fairy tale. They are arbiters of a difficult balance, and that balance is never comfortable. So as we stand at the end of this journey, it feels right to finally rank these four guardians. Not by arbitrary power levels, but by the weight of their lore, the depth of their narrative, and the resonance of their role in Unova's story. This is not a tier list for battle simulators. This is a reckoning of legacy. Fourth, we place Virizion, the swift one, the graceful one, the grass type, whose speed was meant to outrun flames and shield the fleeing. Virizian's lore is beautiful but thin. It is the quietest of the quartet, the one whose legend often fades into the background of Cobalion's leadership and Terrakian's brute force. Its narrative weight comes from its elegance. But in a story about justice, elegance alone does not carry the day. Virizian is the heart of the group. But the heart does not always drive the narrative. Third, Terrakian, the rock of the team, literally and figuratively. Terrakian's power is immense. It broke through obstacles, shattered barriers, and embodied the raw, unyielding force of justice. Its lore, as the Porthos of the musketeer analogy, gives it a clear role, the muscle. But muscle without nuance can become a blunt instrument. In a world of conflicting truths, Terrakian's approach is the simplest. And sometimes simplicity is exactly what is needed. Yet it lacks the complexity that makes a legend endure. It is memorable but not profound. Second, Keldeo, the youngest, the orphan, the one who rose from the ashes of the Moor of Isurus to master secret sword and evolve into resolute form. Keldeo's story is the most human. If we can use that word for a mythical Pokémon, it is a story of loss, training, belonging, and finally reunion. Keldeo bridges the gap between the trio and the wider world, a symbol that justice can be learned, that even the smallest among us can wield a blade. Its narrative weight is immense because it represents hope, but it is still the apprentice, not the master. And first, Cobalion, the leader, the one who calmed unruly Pokémon with a stern gaze, who organized the evacuation during the Great Fire, who set the standard for what a guardian should be. Cobalion's lore is the most complete. It is the iron will, the unshakable resolve, the one who holds the line when everything else crumbles. In a world of conflicting truths, Cobalion does not waver. It does not seek to understand every perspective. It seeks to protect. That single-mindedness is both its strength and its limitation. But in the context of the sacred swords, it is the cornerstone. Without Cobalion, the others scatter. With Cobalion, they become a legend. So there it is. Cobalion, Terrakian, Virizian. A ranking that honors the story, not just the stats. But the story is not over. Unova is a region that breathes with potential. The sacred swords have appeared in Galar's crown tundra, hinting that their duty transcends borders. Could they return to Unova in a future generation, perhaps when the region faces a new threat? A crisis that demands not just the strength of the Dao trio, but the quiet, persistent justice of 4 wandering blades. The Moor of Isurus still stands, scarred but alive. The Pokémon that were saved still remember, and as long as there are fires to fight and truths to balance, the swords of justice will never truly be gone. They are eternal guardians, not because they are immortal, but because the idea they carry, that someone must stand for the voiceless, is eternal. And that, perhaps, is the most comforting thought of all. As you drift off tonight, know that somewhere in the world of Pokémon, Cobalion is watching, Terrakian is ready, Virizian is swift, and Keldeo is still learning. The legend continues, even when we close our eyes. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.